Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? It is a lovely, lovely Sunday afternoon, and I am here. I am here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment, and we are going to have a very interesting conversation today. We have a number of topics we're going to speak about, and of course, a lot of those topics are going to be generated by you. But on my agenda today, I'm going to be talking about the Martin Luther King holiday. I'm going to be talking about capitalism and the definition of it. I'm going to talk a lot about the Islamic Republic of Iran and the recent speech by the supreme leader of Iran, the situation in Iran now that it seems like we're not on the brink of World War III, still a very dangerous situation. I wanted to talk about that and some of the distortions we've seen in U.S. media. I also wanted to talk about William F. Dean, the only American general to have ever been captured, and some of the weird things he says in his autobiography. I also want to talk about the issue of elections, the primary elections, Bernie Sanders, all of what's going on there, Elizabeth Warren, but also the overall view of elections and how revolutionary forces view elections. So we have a lot on the agenda today. I know you're all here with us, and I'm really glad that you are all here. You know, we're a little community here. We get on here once a week and we talk politics in a way that nobody else does. I mean, nobody talks politics the way we do, right? We talk politics in a very, very unique way, and this is not like anything you'll find. This is certainly not like anything you find on the right, certainly not like what you'll find on the mainstream current of the left. We are talking about capitalism, we're talking about economics, we're talking about geopolitics, we're talking about ideology and history. This is a unique channel that we have here. So why don't, before we begin, let me first remind you to please tweet this out, make it a bigger conversation. Please make a Facebook status urging people to join the conversation. The more the merrier. Please hit that like button. Please hit that subscribe button. And be sure to hit that subscribe button because we very well know that YouTube does have a mechanical way of unsubscribing people. That's a very common thing that YouTube does. So if you want to make sure that you stay subscribed, you want to hit that like button, you want to hit that subscribe button, and you want to hit that bell to make sure you get notifications, right? Because if you just don't watch a channel for a while, YouTube kind of automatically unsubscribes you. You can Google it. It's like a policy they have. It's like built in. They've got automation, artificial intelligence gradually, unsubscribes people. So be sure that you stay subscribed by hitting that button. And before we get going, I am going to take a sip of the famous unnamed diet beverage for which I am totally, totally addicted. And without further ado, we're going to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King. So, as you all know, approaching is Dr. Martin Luther King Day, the holiday named in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King. And one thing that drives me up the wall, it just completely drives me up the wall, is seeing voices like Ben Shapiro, seeing commentators like Dinesh D'Souza, seeing YouTube channels like PragerU quote Dr. Martin Luther King, honor Dr. Martin Luther King, and invoke him to support their politics. Because what these people are completely unaware of, make a Discord channel, it's useful for discussion. Well, thank you, Sami. Maybe I will do that. What these people are completely unaware of is that in the final years of his life, we're talking 1966, 1967, and ultimately, 1968, he was gunned down in April of 1968. Martin Luther King opposed capitalism. Martin Luther King openly called for a democratic form of socialism. Now, he was never a Marxist. He was a Christian minister, and he was very critical of Marx in terms of philosophy. He said that Marx's distortion of Hegel was incorrect, that there is a spiritual force driving mankind, and he rejected Marxist materialism. But he opposed capitalism. One of Martin Luther King's last books was called Where Do We Go From Here? And in that book, Martin Luther King called for all citizens of the United States to be guaranteed a job. He wanted guaranteed employment by the state, and he was organizing something called the Poor People's Campaign. And he was mobilizing low-income people, white, black, and Latino, all different races, to march in Washington, to engage in civil disobedience, demanding things like the right to housing, the right to a job, the right to health care. Watch, and I made a video a few years ago that was like a compilation of clips of Dr. Martin Luther King speaking in the final years of his life, where he talks about, that if a man doesn't have a job, his right to pursue happiness is not being fulfilled, that the need to redistribute economic power is massive. You should read his speech Beyond Vietnam, or listen to it. There's audio recordings of it, where he condemned the United States and Vietnam. He said the Vietnamese people were right in demanding that the U.S. government leave, that the greatest purveyor of violence on earth was the U.S. government. Martin Luther King, in the final years of his life, was a lot like the politics you're hearing on here. Right now, he never fully called for the workers to control the means of production. He never fully called for state control of the means of production, but he believed in kind of a Bernie Sanders political model. He was very, very opposed to imperialism, especially in Vietnam, to the point that the NAACP and a lot of the black organizations that had backed him even denounced him for how strongly he was supporting the Vietnamese people and opposing U.S. military presence in Vietnam. And yes, Dr. Martin Luther King, he was a radical. He was a far leftist. He was a pacifist. He did not believe in violence. He was a Christian minister. He was a patriotic American, and he was loyal to the United States. He really believed in the U.S. Constitution. He was not a black nationalist. He opposed black nationalism. He viewed black people as people within the United States who faced discrimination. But Martin Luther King was not a conservative by any means. And all the nasty, hateful things that you hear from these creatures like PragerU, or Ben Shapiro, or Charlie Kirk, or you name it, Dinesh D'Souza, they say nasty things. They say, if you believe in socialism, you're just like Adolf Hitler. If you believe in socialism, socialism is an evil ideology that only appeals to demented, evil people. They say all these kind of things. And then the next tweet, 2 tweets later, they're honoring Dr. Martin Luther King. They are ignoring the fact that every hateful thing they say about Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, Mao, Stalin, everything they say about people who believe in socialism and oppose capitalism applies to Dr. Martin Luther King. Every time you hear Ben Shapiro, every time you hear Dinesh D'Souza, every time you hear Tucker Carlson or Fox News saying all socialists are evil, all socialists are idiots, get Dr. Martin Luther King in your head, because that's who they're talking about. Dr. Martin Luther King called himself a socialist. He opposed capitalism. He opposed U.S. militarism. They are cursing out Dr. Martin Luther King. Every time you turn on Fox News, every time you turn on one of these conservative commentators and hear all the evil things that they say about socialists and hear all the nasty hate that they spew at socialists, every time you hear that, picture Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in your head, because they're talking about him. And they're also talking about Albert Einstein. And they're also talking about Nelson Mandela. They're also talking about all kinds of figures throughout history. John Steinbeck, for goodness sakes. You can go down the line. All those hateful words are directed at not just, figures around the world that have been so effectively demonized, like Mao, like Stalin, but at figures, that are very widely admired. Many of the greatest minds, many of the bravest, heroic people in history have been socialists and communists. And Dr. Martin Luther King was among those folks. And in fact, Dr. Martin Luther King was not a Marxist. He was not a communist. But in his inner circle, he did have someone named Jack Odell, who was a Communist Party member. And he also had a man named Stanley Levinson, who was also a Communist Party member. And in fact, Robert Kennedy, who was U.S. Attorney General, even kind of went out of his way to give MLK a little bit of trouble over that and threaten him over the fact that his inner circle had communists in it, right? So the way Dr. Martin Luther King has been claimed by the right wing in the United States is very, very disgusting. I think it's also important to note that what really preceded the rise of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, it was the assassination or the murder, the lynching of Emmett Till, right? Emmett Till was a teenager who was African-American. He lived in Chicago. He was visiting his family in the South. Allegedly, he whistled at a white woman in a store. It's not clear whether that even really happened. But regardless, he was brutally murdered. The store owner came to the home where he was staying along with one of his sons. They took him away and they tortured him to death and killed him and dumped his body in a river. It was a horrendous racist murder. And when the body was recovered and sent back to Chicago. The mother of Emmett Till, Mamie Till, she had the photograph of Emmett Till's mutilated body, public. She had an open casket, and she had photographers from Jet Magazine, from the Daily Worker, the Communist Party newspaper. I think it was called the People's World or something like that at that point. It wasn't the Daily Worker, but the Communist Party newspaper, Jet Magazine, all kinds of publications came and photographed the corpse of Emmett Till and showed this brutal, brutal murder. And then the Soviet Union and China took that picture and sent it all over the world. And they said, if the American government says it believes in democracy, it says it believes in freedom, take a look at what their idea of democracy is. Take a look at what their idea of freedom is. And that photograph went all over the world, and it caused a huge, huge public relations disaster for the United States. In every African country, it was in newspapers because the Soviet Union made sure that it got publicized. Every communist newspaper in the entire world published it. All kinds of African newspapers saw someone who looked like them, an African, being brutally killed. And in response to that, there was a feeling among the northern wing of the Democratic Party that we got to do something about Jim Crow. It is hurting the image of the United States. And it was in response to that you had a year later, you had the Montgomery bus boycott. And Dr. Martin Luther King became a national figure because he was the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, right? In Montgomery, Alabama, the buses had a law, a rule, that if you were black, you had to sit in the back of the bus, right? You had to give up your seat for a white person. You had to stand for a white person. You had to sit in the back of the bus. And Rosa Parks very famously didn't do that and was jailed for refusing to give her seat up to a white person, right? Very, very famous. And Martin Luther King, he led with the support of the United Auto Workers Union, the UAW, and with the support of the Socialist Party, Norman Thomas, and a lot of other forces. The Communist Party was involved, but they had to be very, very secretive. They were basically functioning as an illegal organization at that point. They led this boycott of the buses in Alabama, refusing to ride the buses to basically try to economically force the bus companies to give up this racist policy. And the reason that Dr. Martin Luther King became the face of it was because he was young. He was like in his 30s at that point. He was a young man, and he wasn't old enough to have been a communist, right? Because all the older ministers in the town, in Montgomery, Alabama, who had been involved in civil rights activism, were all communists or had been to communist meetings and stuff. And so Dr. Martin Luther King was young enough that they couldn't call him a Soviet agent. They couldn't call him a communist. That's why he became a prominent figure. And interestingly, I don't know if folks remember Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice was an African-American woman who was prominent in the Bush administration, became Secretary of State, I believe. Condoleezza Rice, her father was a minister in Montgomery, Alabama, who refused to support Dr. Martin Luther King. He was the only prominent black minister in Montgomery, Alabama, who urged his congregants not to support the bus boycott. So, think about that. That's pretty wild. But that was the situation, right? And so Dr. Martin Luther King, you couldn't have had Dr. Martin Luther King without socialism. Without the Soviet Union, without the Socialist Party, without the United Auto Workers Union, without, everything that was going on in the world, you couldn't have had Dr. Martin Luther King. And furthermore, Dr. Martin Luther King himself, in his final years, on this planet, in his final years on Earth, before his assassination, he himself called for socialism. So for them to invoke Dr. Martin Luther King to push their politics, these people that celebrated the killing of Qasem Soleimani and want a new war against Iran, these people that say that capitalism is the greatest system because greed is good, these people that say that all socialists are insane and evil, how dare they? How dare they? How dare they invoke Dr. Martin Luther King? My challenge to you, this is Caleb Maupin's challenge to you, the viewer, is tomorrow or the next day, you all know somebody who's a Republican, who's a conservative, who hates socialists, who is part of this. You all know somebody. There's somebody in your office where you work. There's somebody at your school. There's somebody in your class. There's a family member of yours. And my challenge to you is to say to them, How dare you? Dr. Martin Luther King was a socialist. All the evil things you say about socialism, all the hate you throw at socialists, you are throwing at Dr. Martin Luther King. Don't let them escape that. That is my Martin Luther King Day challenge to everyone who's watching this. Make sure that your relative, your uncle, your cousin, your classmate, your coworker, your conservative professor, your conservative teacher who goes around saying that socialism is pure evil, socialism killed 100 gajillion million people, you challenge them. You challenge them to say that about Dr. Martin Luther King. Don't let them escape that, right? That if you want to believe what is being preached on Fox News right now, what's being preached by Tucker Carlson, what's being preached by these extreme right-wing forces, that if you want to believe that, you must oppose Dr. Martin Luther King, which they did. I mean, they did. Let's be real about it, right? I mean, they voted against it. The Republicans in big numbers voted against it. They didn't want a holiday for Dr. Martin Luther King. So that's my challenge to you for the holiday. But we have plenty more on the agenda. Let me mention also that I love Super Chats. I appreciate the Super Chats I've gotten. It's great. I know there's a lot of you here who want to help us out and support this. And if you do a Super Chat, I will do that thing where I write it down in this notebook, and I'm sure to address it. I might not do it right off the bat, but I will mention it, and you will have your question answered or acknowledged. I guess if it's really crazy, right? If it's got 4-letter words or sex references in it, I'm not going to address that. But aside from that, if you super chat me, I'm pretty much guaranteed to address it. So just throwing that out there. Now, folks, what is capitalism? 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 I hear a lot of different definitions of it. I've had many people that are supporters of capitalism tell me that they're capitalists. All right, 1858. That a lot of people that are supporters of capitalism tell me that capitalism means having money. At my college, there was a young man who was becoming a stand-up comedian. And one of his jokes was he said, I love, he was kind of overweight, and that was kind of his running joke, was joking about his own weight. And his joke is he said, I love capitalism because I can buy more donuts. That was his joke. And many people say capitalism is money. I've had people tell me that capitalism started in the times of ancient Greece and Rome when currency was invented. I've also had people say, well, capitalism is when the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I've had people tell me that capitalism is a mindset. It's greed, right? If you want to have more money, you're being more capitalist. If you give money to a homeless person, you're being more socialist. What actually is the scientific definition of capitalism? What is capitalism? What is it, right? I mean, we hear all kinds of different definitions of it. What is capitalism? Well, capitalism is a system in which the major centers of economic power function on the basis of profit. Socialism is the alternative to capitalism. But capitalism was defined by Friedrich Engels, who was Karl Marx's close collaborator and was a much better writer than Marx and wrote much clearly. Friedrich Engels said that capitalism, basically the way he defined it was, he said, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Meaning, under capitalism, production, factories, natural resources, big centers of economic power function to make more money. Preliminary transformation into capital. They only function as an investment to make more money. Or, as Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Revolution, the way he explained it, he said, capitalism is profits in command. Profits in command. That was how it was explained by Mao Zedong. Karl Marx, he used the phrase, the anarchy of production. The anarchy of production. Capitalism is a society where profits are in command. That is what capitalism is. If the economy is functioning in order to make profits for a group of owners, it's capitalism. If the economy is planned and functions in a rational way for the benefit of society, that's socialism. That's the difference. That is the difference. And is there planning under capitalism? Sure. Walmart plans out everything, right? Think of these huge multinational corporations, very efficient planning. Now, they'll have people in 58 different countries building one product. I mean, there's all kinds of planning under capitalism, sure, but that planning is carried out as preliminary transformation into capital. That planning is carried out simply for the purpose of making profits for the shareholders of the corporation. So yes, there's planning under capitalism, but it is planning to make more profits. It's not planning about rational human needs. Socialism is when the economy is organized to serve public good and not profits. That's the difference between capitalism and socialism. And the problems of capitalism are numerous, right? Under capitalism, you have all kinds of irrational things that take place. Under capitalism, for example, you have a prison industrial complex where we want more people to be locked up and go to prison because there's more profits to be made from it. It's not good for our society. But for corporations having the biggest prison population in the world, mass incarceration makes lots of money. Take the opioid epidemic. Why was it in the 90s that drug companies in the United States were sending people out to say that opioid addiction was a myth? Look at some of these PowerPoints these opioid manufacturers did. They sent their drug company, their drug salespeople, their pharmaceutical representatives out to speak to doctors and tell them, well, we've done a scientific study and opioid addiction is not real. It's made up, so be sure to just, hand out painkillers as much as you can. Opioid addiction is a myth. Like, they did this. You can see this. They have lists of myths. These pharmaceutical, big pharma salespeople would have a list of myths. Myth number 1, pain improves character. Myth number 2, opioids are addictive. They went out and told people. Neon Noir is asking about Che Guevara. They went out and told people that it was a myth that opioids were addictive. They were lying in order to get people hooked on opioids, right? Why were they doing that? To make more profits, right? That was preliminary transformation into capital. They saw sending their salespeople out, telling lies. They saw it as a way to make profits. The military-industrial complex, right? Why is Trump very close to Betsy DeVos, whose brother is Eric Prince of Blackwater, the military contractor corporation? Why is Saudi Arabia so valuable to the United States? Because we buy their oil and we sell them weapons, lots and lots of weapons. The military-industrial complex, talk about Bernie Marcus, the owner of Home Depot. Go into any Home Depot. Try to find one product that isn't somehow tied to a Pentagon-contracted corporation. The stimulus of the U.S. economy has become the selling of weapons around the world and the building up of a huge military apparatus. Why? Because it is more profitable. It's not good for the people. However, it makes lots of profits. Right? This is the situation. Right? And it gets worse than that. The capitalist is constantly trying to replace workers with machines. And this goes back to like the beginning of time, the beginning of capitalism. It is cheaper for the capitalist when he has fewer workers. The fewer workers he has, the less workers he has to pay. The easier to replace those workers are, the less he can get away with paying them. So the capitalist is constantly trying to push workers out of the means of production. And as a result, he's able to churn out products more effectively than ever, cheaper than ever, right? He can start producing products cheaper than ever, but then, with so few workers hired in the means of production, he cannot sell those products. And this is the boom-bust cycle of the market, right? That under capitalism, automation and economic development leads to poverty, right? The Great Depression of the 1930s was largely a result of Henry Ford and the fact that he had figured out how to far more efficiently produce cars, and his assembly line techniques of advancing and making production more effective had driven all kinds of people out of work, and pretty soon the market was glutted with products that couldn't be sold. And we had a Great Depression because in the 1920s, coming out of World War I, there had been huge leaps in industrial efficiency. As a result of that, there was an economic crisis, right? And that led to World War II ultimately, right? The fallout from that economic crisis. The economic crisis currently hanging over the world is the computer revolution. The computer revolution is great. It's amazing. It has enabled us to do all kinds of things with artificial intelligence, with smartphones, internet, you name it. But the result under capitalism, where human beings only exist so long as they can sell their labor, it results in poverty. Under capitalism, efficiency and technological advancement walks hand in hand with poverty. This is not rational, and the only way it can be resolved is for a rationally planned economy to come into existence, an economy that doesn't function on the basis of profits. Under capitalism, human beings are commodities. And that's what we are to Apple, that's what we are to Microsoft, that's what we are to you name it. We, human beings, to the capitalists, to the owners of the means of production, we are commodities. We are a financial value, and if we die, or if we're killed, or if we get addicted to opioids, or we get locked in prison, or we get sent off to fight in some ugly war to secure their profits, that's what they refer to as an externality. An externality. Google it, externality. Why? Because it doesn't affect their profit margin. It's external. You and me are an externality to the capitalists. We spend money, then we're not external, sure. But, if we get harmed by their actions and there's no financial consequence, you and I are an externality to those who own the means of production. This is the reality of what capitalism is. Martin Luther King Jr. opposed it. Albert Einstein opposed it, right? The people of the Soviet Union, the people of China opposed it. The people of Iran oppose it. They call their system not capitalism, but Islam. The people of Venezuela and Bolivia and many countries have risen up to abolish capitalism. The people who built the labor unions opposed it, right? The women, the suffragists opposed it, right? Helen Keller opposed it, right? Opposing capitalism is called common sense. We're in a period where there are rising alternatives to capitalism on the global market. And so that's what I would like to talk about. But why don't we do that thing that we always do? I know you've all been waiting for it. Why don't we do that thing that we always do where you call out your name and location and I shout you out as I see you, because I know this is a growing community. We've already got a couple super chats we're going to get to later. We've got to talk about Iran, and I've got some important things to say about that. But why don't we do not some super chats, but some when you call out. Just tell me where you are. New Jersey, Mom's Basement, Paul in D.C., Lee County, Florida, Avante in Missouri, Liverpool, UK, Hi from Cleveland, UK, Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Arizona, Saxony, Florida, Hawaii, San Diego, St. Louis, Auckland, New Zealand, Stanley Stanlin from Staten Island, Texas, Independence, Missouri, Space Communist, good afternoon, Caleb, he's out in LA, Southern California, Utah, Salem, Oregon, Washington, D.C., Kentucky, KY, Kentucky, Shaniqua in Buffalo, Newer Viewer from Cleveland, Ohio, Southeast UK, Ohio State University, Lee in British Columbia, Portugal, North Carolina. Keep it coming, folks. I got plenty of diet beverage. Bahrain. Oh, you're brave to watch me in Bahrain. Independence, Missouri. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Denmark. Frankfurt, Germany. Ireland. Gateshead in the northeast of England. Portugal. Miguel Piera. St. George, Utah, West Virginia, Virginia. Wow. The Netherlands. Kazuya is in Brooklyn, and I'm here in Brooklyn also. This is my lovely Brooklyn apartment where I'm in front of my bookshelf. Trump County, Indiana, Austria, United Kingdom, the Philippines. Shout out to those in the Philippines. Utah. Wow. Wow. Wow, folks. Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia. West Virginia. Rachel Martinez. Tampa, Florida. Reno, Nevada. Very interesting. Adam M. is in Reno, Nevada. Quite an audience we have here. Quite an audience we have. Wow, what a lovely day. Watching from Florida, says Sebastian. Reza, Iran. Yes, folks. One day we will have an audience on Mars, says Bolshevik Hawk. And I do agree with that. Wilkes-Barre. I don't know where Wilkes-Barre is. Independence, Missouri is where Rachel is. Austin, Texas, Pennsylvania, Ontario, Canada. Great times, folks. Great times. Great times. So, folks, if you've been paying attention to our media, you will have heard, and Lawrence Chu is in Albany. If you've been paying attention to our media, you will have heard that the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Syed Khamenei, who is the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, recently gave a speech. And that speech was at the Friday prayer in Iran. And it was a very big deal because the supreme leader of Iran has not spoken at a Friday prayer in 8 years. It was a big deal. So, seeing these reports in American media, I noticed that while these reports were all, it was very interesting. The reports were almost a caricature, right? They showed the supreme leader, they showed crowds of people, and it was like the reports were basically saying subtly, be very, very afraid of Iran, big scary leader give big scary speech, be very, very afraid of Iran. You know? You think about that movie from the 80s, They Live. And in that movie, it's like, the newspapers, he has the glasses on and it says like, be afraid, or, it's like, it's like there was not much, not much content. They didn't really get into what the supreme leader of Iran actually said. So I, being one of these people who likes to dig further, decided that I would find out before the live today what the supreme leader Khamenei of the Islamic Republic of Iran actually said. And it wasn't so easy. I don't know why, folks, but on my iPhone, I can get any web page to load, but Khamenei.ir, or English.Khamenei.ir, the official website of the head of state of the Islamic Republic of Iran, won't load. And I tried. I could not get it to load. Now, other people in the United States have gotten it, so it's not a whole U.S. problem. But I could not. I kept reloading it. I changed the Wi-Fi settings. I could go to other websites. But for some reason, on my iPhone, I could not visit Khamenei.ir. I don't know what that's about. Now, other people got it, but they all noted that it loads a lot slower than other websites. You go to yahoo.com, boom. You go to Khamenei.ir, and it's very, very, very slow. And someone recommended trying a VPN. I'm curious. I'm curious what's going on there, right? We don't really know what's going on. I couldn't get it to load on my iPhone. Other people were able to get it to load on computers, but it was slow. It was very, very slow. I find that to be very interesting. Very, very interesting. But luckily, I was able to get a copy of the Supreme Leader's remarks, and I will read you a few of the highlights. Now, I think it's interesting, he spoke in Arabic, from what I understand, because he was speaking to people throughout the region, and that Farsi is spoken by Iranians, but Arabic is more the language of the region. and especially because the Quran is in Arabic, and Muslims around the world tend to speak Arabic. But I wanted to read you just a couple of the things that were in the speech. Number one, he said that a nation has the powerful and spirit has. I'm sorry. Let me start again. That a nation has the power and spirit to slap an arrogant, aggressive global power is a sign of God's power. And he's referring to the fact that Iran retaliated to the USA and its strike that murdered, the head of the Quds Force, the head of the IRGC, Qasem Soleimani. And then he describes Soleimani, very powerful words. He says, Martyr Soleimani would enter an area completely surrounded by enemy helicopter. There would be good young men in the area who were alone, without a commander. They would see Soleimani and would gain spirit and motivation. Right? It seems to me he's referring to the fact that Qasem Soleimani, who was known as the Ghost, that was his nickname, he had kind of a spiritual value to the people of Iran. He was more than just a military figure. He was kind of a legend, and it was never known exactly where he was. And he kind of represented the military martyrdom, revolutionary culture that comes out of the revolution. Very fascinating. And so Khamenei goes on, and he says they did not confront him on the battlefield. They assassinated him thievishly and cowardly. And that's true, right? According to the Iraqi Prime Minister, Qasem Soleimani was actually on a peace mission, right? They didn't call him Qasem Soleimani on the battlefields of Iraq where he was fighting ISIS, the battlefields of Syria where he was fighting ISIS. They didn't kill him in some kind of situation. And they've tried to say that he was planning attacks on Americans, but the whole world knows that whole story is starting to fall apart. And Trump has even said, well, it doesn't matter if he was actually planning to kill Americans. We've seen this. So essentially, right? Soleimani is killed. The supreme leader is speaking about it. And he says that Iran needs to become a more powerful country. And he says in the speech that the main response of Iran to the killing of Soleimani will be to drive the United States out of the Middle East. And the thing is, Americans overwhelmingly want that to happen. They want the United States out of the Middle East. That's what Americans want. Poll after poll shows that. Obama promised that, and Americans elected Obama. Trump promised that, and Americans elected Donald Trump. Americans want to get out of the Middle East overwhelmingly. Iran is now promising to drive the United States out of the Middle East. So average Americans and Iran are on the same team here. So who is it who doesn't want the United States to leave the Middle East? I'm just asking you that. Who is it? Right? Overwhelming majority of the U.S. public wants us out of the Middle East. Overwhelming majority of Iraqis want us out of Iraq. Iranians want us out of the region. Right? I mean, the people of these regions, they want us out of the Middle East. So why are we still in the Middle East? If the USA was truly a democracy, we'd be out of there. There are other forces in the United States that have the power. There are rich and powerful interests that want us still in the Middle East. We all know that. The myth of American democracy is exposed right here. We don't want to be in the Middle East. The military, among soldiers, they don't even want to be in the Middle East. Right? Why are we still in the Middle East? If the USA is a democracy, we should have left a long, long time ago, right? If the USA were helping the people of the Middle East, and the people of the Middle East, like Iraq, took a vote and said they didn't want us there, then we should have left a long time ago. Now, the Supreme Leader also talks about Iran becoming a more powerful country. And he says, power isn't just military strength. The country's economy must be strengthened. An end should be put to the reliance on oil. Scientific and technological growth must continue. And he's absolutely right about that. And this is the curse of the Middle East. It's the curse of the Middle East. Right? During the Gulf War in the 90s, the Democrats in the United States constantly made the argument that the way to end U.S. military involvement in the Middle East was through energy independence. That became the slogan of the Democrats. Energy independence. We need energy independence. The reason that we had to fight the Gulf War, the reason that we had to have troops in Lebanon, the reason that we had to be giving all kinds of weapons and guns and money to Israel, they said supposedly, was because we need their oil. We're dependent on their oil. And so if we can gain energy independence, this is what big Democrats like Bill Clinton and Walter Mondale and people like that, Mike Dukakis, all of them were saying, if we just get energy independence, we can withdraw our forces from the Middle East. Don't drive a car, ride your bike so that we can get out of the Middle East. I am an American politician, and I am caring about the people. And if we can ride bicycles and we can have electric cars, we will not be in the Middle East. So vote for me so I can end energy independence. I mean, we've seen it. Like, think about John Kerry. I'm John Kerry, and if we can get energy independence, then we can get out of the Middle East. Vote for me. I am John Kerry, the most boring human being who's ever existed. Vote for me, and we will get out of the Middle East because we will have energy independence. Right? I mean, it's classic. I mean, this goes back. You watch Jimmy Carter, his malaise speech. You remember the malaise speech? Right? Jimmy Carter, at the time the USA is having an economic downturn, and he gets on there, and he says to the American people, it's a crisis of confidence. People don't love their country anymore. They don't feel like we're doing well. I think too many of us put an interest in owning things and buying things and wanting things. And it was like the biggest political disaster of Jimmy Carter's entire presidency. It basically cost him the presidency. It was a 30-minute speech called Crisis of Confidence. They call it the malaise speech because Jimmy Carter got on there and talked in the most whiny, depressing voice ever. And he told the U.S. public, at the time they were having a huge economic downturn, people were losing their jobs, mass layoffs, like Detroit was facing layoffs in the auto plants at that point. A lot of African Americans who had just a decade earlier gotten jobs in the auto plants. Suddenly, after the 60s, early 70s, they started hiring African Americans in auto plants, and Motor City, finally African Americans could get jobs. It was very exciting. They're laying them off in big numbers all of a sudden, right? And all these Americans were losing their jobs, right? It's like they're having an economic downturn, the first major economic downturn we'd ever had since the Second World War. And instead of Jimmy Carter saying, I am going to stand up to Wall Street and fight for the working class, he didn't say that. He said, you should not be so concerned about owning things and having things and wanting things. And very famously, it wasn't in the speech, but he did this. He started wearing a sweater. He started wearing a sweater, I kid you not. The President of the United States, at the time people are losing their jobs, he starts walking around in a sweater and saying, instead of turning up the heat at the White House, I am wearing a sweater. And I think this is what Americans should do. If you are having trouble paying your gas bill, you should just wear a sweater. That is what we are going to do. I mean, that was Jimmy Carter's response. Epic. I mean, it was a political disaster. Right? It's one thing, sure. Is he pointing to something that is probably true? Are Americans too materialistic? Yes. Is consumer culture disgusting? Yes. Right? I don't disagree with that. But at a time when people are literally hungry, when parents are worried about feeding their kids, to give everyone a lecture on why you need to be more frugal, and you should wear a sweater instead of turning up the heat. I, Jimmy Carter, am wearing a sweater. I am the president. I mean, it was awful. It was an epic disaster that Jimmy Carter did. It was just horrendous, right? But in that speech, if you listen to it, in that speech, he makes reference to scientists and how the government, not the private sector, no, but in order to reduce American energy independence, the government was funding research into a new process of extracting oil and natural gas from American shale. Jimmy Carter was pushing fracking in 1978. In 1978, Jimmy Carter was pushing fracking. And it was government funded, government research. I mean, you can't make this up, right? They say the private sector always solves things. The government, under Jimmy Carter, started funding research into hydraulic fracking, extracting oil and gas from shale, in the hopes that it could lead to energy independence. And it did. It took decades. It took 30, 40 years. But now the United States is exporting oil and gas. Now the United States is the world's top oil producer and top natural gas producer because of hydraulic fracking. We have energy independence in the United States right now. We have energy independence. It's happened, right? John Kerry and Walter Mondale and Bill Clinton all were saying that if we could just get energy independence, then we would no longer have to be in the Middle East. We have energy independence. So why in the world are we in the Middle East? Because it's not about that. It's not about energy independence. It was never about energy independence. The slogan of the Trump White House basically spells out what it's really about. The slogan of the Trump White House is energy dominance. Who runs the world? Who are the most powerful and wealthy people in the world? The owners of oil corporations. Chase Bank, the biggest bank on Wall Street, is basically ExxonMobil, right? JP Morgan Chase, it's the Morgans and the Rockefellers. It's Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, merged with JP Morgan's manufacturing apparatus into one gigantic global bank, Chase Bank. That is one of the most powerful entities. But there's another entity that folks have heard of, very powerful bank called HSBC Bank. Now, what does HSBC stand for? Now, it stands for Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. So you say, oh, see, it's those Chinese communists. Well, no, it's not a Chinese bank. It has a name, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, but it is based in London. And this was a bank set up by the East India Company and certain financial entities in Britain for the purpose of controlling China's markets. The Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation was set up by British capitalists in the 1880s to control the Chinese market. And one way they did it was with drug money, with opium. Right? And the HSBC Bank was the opium bank. It was the bank that the Chinese people and their emperor tried to force out of the country, not once but twice, with 2 opium wars. That's HSBC Bank. And what entity is basically the lifeblood of HSBC Bank? British Petroleum, BP. BP. So BP is HSBC Bank. Chase Bank is ExxonMobil. Are you starting to understand who rules the world? All right. What about Royal Dutch Shell? Royal Dutch Shell. It's Shell Oil. It's Royal Dutch Shell is their actual name. Now, why are they called Royal Dutch Shell? Well, originally, it was owned by a monarchy in the Netherlands. But it got bought up by the British and by American corporations. And even though it is technically Royal Dutch Shell, it is at this point controlled by British corporations and American corporations. And let me add, which particular family from Britain, which banking dynasty in Britain is heavily invested in Royal Dutch Shell? The Rothschilds. Now, I mean, that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they're Jewish, okay? And that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and this whole thing about Jews, and that's not where I'm going with this at all, you know? And people that push anti-Semitism, it's a little bit of ignorance, right? The Rockefellers are just as powerful, and they're not Jewish. They're more powerful, I would say. So throw the anti-Semitic conspiracies out. But banking dynasties, banking families, elite banking institutions based in Wall Street and in London dominate the world. And the way they do it, the way that they do it is by control of the energy markets. You got Chevron, don't forget Chevron. And don't forget Total. Now, Total is a French entity. And if you combine Total, Chevron, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, and ExxonMobil, if you combine that, if you combine those 5 companies, one's in France, the rest are British and American, if you combine them, what do you get? You get 85% of the world's oil production. 85%. You want to talk about a monopoly. You want to talk about a cartel, right? They call OPEC the cartel in Wall Street Journal and all that. Well, the cartel is the 4 super majors. They are a cartel, and they control the world. And part of controlling the world is controlling oil-rich centers of the world. And what are those oil-rich centers? The Middle East, right? The Middle East is an oil-rich center, right? And Africa, Nigeria, is an oil-rich center, right? Venezuela. And occasionally, throughout the 20th century, you've had countries break free. I mean, even the Russian Revolution, right? Russia was the oil producer at the time of World War I mean, it had oil. Azerbaijan, outside the United States, Azerbaijan was one of the only oil-producing places. And the Russian Revolution was basically the Russian people seizing control of Azerbaijan, right? The Russian people, the Tsarist Empire, controlled Azerbaijan. And you know, the Russian people rose up. And what was one of the first places the British sent their troops when they wanted to put down? I don't know what that is, David, but thanks for the super chat. I don't know what that is. What was one of the first places the British sent their military in response to the Russian Revolution? To Azerbaijan, to the oil fields of Baku. That's where the British military was sent because the Bolsheviks seized the oil fields of Azerbaijan in Baku. And in response to that, the British army was sent to go and get it back. Get it back for Royal Dutch Shell. Get it back for British Petroleum, right? It was fighting to seize the oil fields. And a lot of the fighting in the Russian Civil War didn't happen in Russia. It happened in Azerbaijan. The Red Army and the Bolsheviks fought against, and I really appreciate that, Fred. Thank you for that very generous offer. I do appreciate it. But basically, the Red Army was trying to seize the oil fields of Azerbaijan, and the British were trying to keep them from not doing it. Much of the fighting in the Russian Civil War was about oil, and that was just Russia, right? What do you think? What do you think the Libyan Revolution of 1969, where Gaddafi came to power, was about? Oil. And what did Gaddafi do? He used that oil to industrialize Libya and build the biggest at that point in the world. I mean, he built the man-made river, which is the world's biggest irrigation system. What do you think the Iraqi Revolution and the Baathists, were about? What was Baathist Arab socialism in Iraq about? Oil. What do you think the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was about? Oil, right? The Shah of Iran was letting, the Rockefellers rip off the Iranian people and keep them in poverty. So the Iranian people had a revolution, an Islamic revolution in 1979, and now they've used the oil to build up and industrialize the country. What do you think Venezuela and Bolivarian socialism is about? Right? The struggle of people around the world to seize control of their natural resources and to carve out their own place in this energy market. This global energy market, that has defined the 20th century. The 20th century was one big oil war. As we moved toward an oil-based economy, oil enabled the United States to win World War I. Oil enabled the United States to win World War II. And the Cold War, all of the 20th century, was basically a fight over the oil markets. And you have the petrodollar being declared, right? The petrodollar. And what was the petrodollar? It was at Bretton Woods, this big meeting to set up the global financial system after the Second World War. They declare that you have to trade oil in dollars, right? Oil. And what is the greatest fear? What is the greatest fear of the oil banking elite that runs the world, of the Wall Street and London bankers? What is their greatest fear? Electric cars. nuclear power, nuclear fusion, cold fusion. If the world gets out of the trap of fossil fuels, they won't rule the world any longer. That is the reality of the situation. If we can get out of the trap of fossil fuels, and we're not going to get out of it with solar panels, and we're not going to get out of it with windmills. Look, I'm all for it, right? If people want to diversify and have more green energy, I'm for it. But I'm just telling you, the only way to get out of it, the only way that we can get out of the trap of fossil fuels is with a higher form of energy. We can get energy from water. Talk about helium-3, this element that is on the moon. That's why China recently launched their spacecraft to the far side of the moon. It's to get that helium-3, to start experimenting with helium-3 and its use in alternative energy. If we can get out of the trap of fossil fuels, humanity can be free from imperialism, from the rule of the world by Western banking oil cartels, right? And the oil cartels, they know this. They know this very, very well, right? Among the fracking companies and among the industrial sectors of the economy that kind of resent the monopoly by the big banks and oil companies, you get global warming denial. Global warming, they insist, is not real. It's something made up to try and put them out of business. But among the big energy corporations, you get the opposite. You get climate pessimism, right? The answer to climate change is an end to historical progress. The answer to climate change is reducing the human population. The answer to climate change is reducing the amount of electricity that countries use, keeping third world countries poor to make sure they don't pollute too much. That's what they think the answer is. They can only look backwards. They know fossil fuels are bad for the environment, which they are. So you have their response, which is, okay, we'll keep our monopoly and the world will just transition to a lower level of development, a lower level of use of energy, and we'll all just get used to a lower lifestyle, and we'll reduce the human population, and it'll all work out. That's what big oil thinks. Little oil, frackers, what they think, oh, global warming isn't real. It's a big communist conspiracy to take away our profits. The greenies are all a bunch of communists, and it's all a big communist plot. I mean, yeah, they're saying that, and whatever. But big oil, their feeling is the opposite. They say, yeah, fossil fuels are bad, and the rest of the world needs to stop developing so that we can stay at the top of the world. China and Iran and Russia just called for international cooperation around fusion energy. They have the alternative. Which is historical progress, nuclear fusion, cold fusion, right? Helium-3. There has to be a higher form of energy. We should think. Who says we can't start extracting energy from the moon? Who says we can't start extracting energy from Mars? I know it sounds a little science fiction, but I think it's possible. But we have to look forward. Eco-pessimism isn't the answer. Climate denial isn't the answer either. We have to look forward. And Iran, beautifully, right? This is what the Supreme Leader said. Power isn't just military strength. The country's economy must be strengthened. An end should be put to reliance on oil. For a country like Iran that is sitting on so much of an oil deposit, like an oil-based country, for them to have the forward thinking and vision to realize that is very, very powerful. Science and technological growth must continue. I interviewed a couple years back a fusion energy scientist named Dr. Eric Lerner in New Jersey, who does fusion energy research for a living. That's what he does for a living. And he talked about how because of the sanctions on Iran, it was very difficult for him to cooperate with Iranian labs that are carrying out fusion energy research. Believe it or not, even though Iran's economy is all centered around oil, the Iranian government is funding fusion energy research like crazy. And so is the Russian government, and so is the Chinese government. And here in the United States, we're doing everything we can to crush it. That's what's going on here. That is the situation that we are in, right? This oil trap needs to be gotten rid of. Folks, if you're just joining us, please tweet this out. Bring people in. Make this a bigger conversation. Hit that like button. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the bell. Bring people on. I am happy to keep going here. We have plenty to discuss, but let's keep it going. Let's keep the show on the road. Let's bring people in. It's always great to talk with all of you. It's a lovely afternoon. I'm here in my Brooklyn apartment. We have so much to talk about. Folks, when I saw those pictures of the Iranian people rallying, the millions, literally millions of Iranians who poured in to see the Supreme Leader speak at the Friday prayers, how they all chant, "The blood in my vessels belongs to the Supreme Leader. The blood in my vessels belongs to the Supreme Leader." I was forced to think of a quotation. The people of a small country can surely defeat aggression by a big country if only they dare to rise in struggle and grasp into their own hands the destiny of their country. This is a law of history. Let me repeat that. The people of a small country can surely defeat aggression by a big country, but only if they dare to rise in struggle and grasp the destiny of their country into their own hands. This is a law of history. One more time, folks. The people of a small country can surely defeat aggression by a big country, but only if they dare to rise in struggle and grasp the destiny of their country in their own hands. This is a law of history. Now, who said that? Who said that? That was Mao Zedong in 1970. It was one of Mao Zedong's final statements. It's beautiful. Beautiful stuff. And it's true. And it happened in Korea. And it happened in Vietnam. And it happened in Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas are in power, despite all the hell and horror that was rained on that country by Ronald Reagan. And it's happened in Venezuela. And it's happened all over the world. Right? This is a law of history. And if the United States were to attack or invade Iran, the United States would be defeated. I'm very confident of that. I've been to Iran. I actually was taken in 2015 to see the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. And I saw him speak, and I cannot give adequate words to describe what I witnessed. I just can't do it. If I try, I've spoken about it before. I've written about it, but I cannot use words to describe the emotional impact that had on me. I just can't do it. When he walked into the room, the energy in that room was massive. I mean, it's like you can't understand it. And then to be in that room, to be just a couple 100 feet away from the Supreme Leader, to be with diplomats. I was standing in the room back in 2015. I was standing with, diplomats, right? There's a lot of African diplomats, a lot of Chinese diplomats wearing their suits, and we're standing there. Some of us have chairs, and we're standing there in our suits. We're just calm, and we're listening, and we have translation in our ear. But if you look out onto that audience, thousands of people packed into this mausoleum, where I saw the Supreme Leader speak about the death of Khomeini and what Khomeini stands for, was something else. This crowd of people, working class people, people from all over the country, teenagers in military uniforms, people that had bussed in. The opportunity to see the Supreme Leader was like the greatest moment of their lives. And to see a crowd of thousands of people walk in, and when he walks into the room, they all start sobbing, just crying, just to see his presence. They extend their hands. They say, "The blood in my vessels belongs to the Supreme Leader." And to hear him speak, the way they hang on his words, it was something unbelievable. It was something unbelievable. I cannot describe it. It was an experience that changed me as a human being. I'm one of the few Americans. There's probably very, very few Americans that have ever experienced this. I'm one of them. And the most extreme moment of that day in 2015, where I saw Khamenei speak, the most extreme moment was when Khamenei talked about how America is called by Iranians the Great Satan. Shaitan-e-Bazorg. That's what Iranians refer to the United States as. Shaitan-e-Bazorg, the Great Satan. And he said, we don't hate the American people. He didn't have to say that. He didn't have to say that. There was one American there, me. So there was no reason for him to say that. But he didn't have to say that, but he did. He said, we don't hate the Iranian people, or we don't hate the American people. We hate the system that the United States represents. We hate the system that the United States represents. We hate militarism, we hate war, we hate imperialism. That's what he said. He said, we do not hate the American people. And then I stood there as the only American in an audience, maybe 20,000 people, probably more than that, as the whole audience began raising their fists like this, pumping their fists and chanting, "Death to America, death to America." And I cannot tell you how overwhelmed with emotion I was in that moment. My eyes filled with tears, and I was in another place. It was so powerful. I cannot describe it. It was an experience that changes a person. And I cannot really put into words what I experienced there. But it forced me into a situation where I had to really consider what it meant to be an American. And I had to seriously think about my role in the world and about who I was. And I feel like that moment for me was a moment that forced me to politically mature. I had been an ultra-left, right? I had been part of an ultra-leftist group that went around having little rallies. And, I was more ultra-left than they were. I thought they weren't ultra-left enough. I wanted them to burn American flags, and I remember we used to chant, "We are not Americans, we are proletarians. We are not Americans, we are proletarians." And it was silly. It was silly. And it was stupid. It was stupid. And it was political amateurishness of the highest degree. And, it was because of my activism with that group, with Occupy Wall Street, that I'd ended up in Iran. And it was that moment. And it was being on a ship and going to Yemen and trying to deliver humanitarian aid to the people of Yemen. And then afterwards going and seeing the Supreme Leader speak. It was that moment that forced me to grow up politically. I was done acting stupid. It's hard to explain, but I was done acting stupid. I was done LARPing. They talk about live action role play. Most of the people in the United States that are being communists are LARPing. They're dressing up in costumes. They're pretending that they're great communist leaders from the past. They're wearing fur hats, and they're yelling at each other for who is the most radical. I'm more radical than you are. You're not as radical as me. My group is more radical than your group. Your group is not as radical as my group. It's childishness. It's immature. And being in Iran and being in that moment and everything, it forced me to politically wake up. It forced me to realize that this isn't a game. This is real. I could have died on that ship to Yemen. And, this isn't a game. This isn't a game. And childish ultra-left adventurism, talk of violent revolution, burning the American flag. We are not Americans. We are proletarians. That's immaturity. That's juvenile. That's adolescent. But those of us who live in the United States of America, who understand the way the world works, we have a great responsibility. A great responsibility to do this in a way that actually changes the world. We have a responsibility to do this in a way that actually gets things done. We have a responsibility to not continue playing games, right? This is not a game. And I guess and I had some spiritual awakenings during that trip as well. My faith in God was much more secured, right? I had been a communist atheist, kind of. I never really was an atheist, I would say. I never really was an atheist. I always had a kind of spiritual motivation, but I was skeptical, and I was very frustrated having grown up around a lot of evangelicals. But my understanding of spiritual matters was cemented. I'm not a Muslim. I did not become a Muslim. I'm a Christian, but my understanding of the spiritual motivations that drives human beings, my understanding of human history was cemented. It was a big moment for me. And I couldn't be an ultra-left anymore at that point. I just couldn't be an ultra-left anymore. I couldn't be one of these childish people in a protest cage, LARPing and having a tantrum against the world. I had to take this more seriously. Right? I had to be more mature about it. And I had to wrangle with myself and my own motivations. It was a very, very important occurrence. I'm really, really glad I had the opportunity to see Iran's supreme leader. And people are right. I hate that system too. We hate this system too. A lot of people in the United States hate American capitalism and don't realize it. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the very famous communist in the United States, she said, very famously, a lot of Americans are communists and don't know it yet. And she's right. I think that's absolutely true. She is absolutely right. A lot of Americans are communists and don't know it yet. Right? I was watching something the other day, and this woman who's like a libertarian from Texas, she calls herself a libertarian, for goodness sakes. And she sounds talking about the ruling class and the American people being left behind, but she doesn't have the education to understand that socialism is the answer. But you listen to her, she sounds like a communist, right? folks, so much to talk about. So a couple other things I wanted to talk about, but more diet beverage. It's getting late. I don't want to drink it too much, right? I don't want to stay up half the night. What's on people's minds? I have 2 super chats I need to get to. So the first super chat that I need to get to is from Lawrence Chu. And Lawrence Chu is asking me about 1858. And that's true. In 1858, when Lincoln was first entering the political sphere on a national scale, when the Republican Party was being formed, they sounded very, very radical. Abraham Lincoln was from Illinois, which at that point was it was like the Wild West of the United States, unsettled territory. They had a song, Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness, came up from the wilderness, right? And Abraham Lincoln was portrayed and thank you, Fred, I do appreciate it. I'm just doing the best I can here. Abraham Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln was, portrayed as kind of a populist, right? And he was an average person's person, and you listen to his speeches, he was very in favor of labor unions, very strongly in favor of labor unions. He thought labor unions were very, very, very good. He thought labor unions he said, thank God we live in a country where men have the right to strike. Strongly opposed to slavery, working class guy, he was for the common people. And Karl Marx spoke very glowingly of Abraham Lincoln. He spoke of Abraham Lincoln as being this very, very, progressive figure and the son of the working class who's leading the Second American Revolution. 1858, the Republicans were a very, very left-wing radical party. Now, the second super chat I got was from Neon Noir, and he's asking me if Fidel Castro, quote, sold out Che Guevara. Well, at this time, the Cuban government does not recognize any political disagreements between Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. They don't acknowledge them. Furthermore, it is widely acknowledged that in his agreement with Fidel Castro to join the Cuban Revolution, let's remember, Che Guevara was not from Cuba. He was an Argentine citizen. That in his agreement with Fidel Castro, he said, I will join and help you wage the Cuban Revolution, but you have to let me then go spread the revolution elsewhere. Right? That's what Che Guevara said. You have to let me spread the revolution elsewhere. And that was their agreement. And he didn't do it immediately. Right? Immediately after the Cuban Revolution, he did give a conference where he called for the revolution to spread, but he never actually, he spent a lot of time in Cuba. He was running like the National Bank. But he left Cuba. And he tried to lead a revolution in Bolivia, and it didn't work out too well. And he was killed. Now, the question then becomes, was that the right thing to do? And I will be honest, folks, as much as I admire Che Guevara, as much as I find Che Guevara to be very eloquent and such, I don't agree with his economic theories. And I think that ultimately, his theory of waging guerrilla warfare, I'm not sure that was necessarily the right thing to do at that time. Not for me to say, obviously. But, Bolivia had a strong communist party in Bolivia. Thousands and thousands and millions of members in Bolivia. But they did not support Che Guevara and his armed revolution. They didn't think it was the right thing to do at that time. You're right, it was the CIA that ultimately killed Che Guevara, right? They captured him in Bolivia in cooperation with Bolivian military forces. Che Guevara was executed. And basically, when that occurred, what's interesting is that, the Communist Party of Argentina, where Guevara was from, didn't speak very highly of Che Guevara because they thought it was an ultra-left adventurist activity in Bolivia. But Juan Perón did. Juan Perón actually wrote a glowing obituary for Che Guevara. The Tricontinental Congress, that was formed after Che Guevara's death, I believe, where I think there was the first one was held, and he gave the Many Vietnams speech and, calling for many Vietnams to be formed. But then afterwards, you had an entity in Cuba called the Tricontinental Congress. And at that point, they were supporting armed revolutions around Latin America and around the world. And if you read the Tricontinental publications, they were very pro-Ba'ath. They were very supportive of Gaddafi. They were very supportive of the FARC in Colombia and very supportive of different armed groups. And in Latin America, most countries at that point had military juntas running them. It was U.S. government military juntas, U.S.-backed and armed military regimes. And so across Latin America, you had armed revolts where the communists couldn't organize in the cities. They couldn't organize in the cities because it was a military dictatorship. If you were caught with any communist books or literature, you were killed. So they were in the countryside where the rural peasants were, and they organized the peasants, and they waged guerrilla warfare with the peasantry. And that was, I mean, that made sense. And it worked. In Nicaragua, that's how they seized power, right? It was very quick. It was like boom, boom, boom. Nicaragua's not a very big country. But yeah, I mean, the Sandinistas of Nicaragua, their newspaper was called Issue 1, Volume 1. Because every time they would come out with a new issue of it, the government would ban the publication. So their newspaper jokingly became Issue 1, Volume 1, because every issue of it became Issue 1, Volume 1, because they had to come up with a new name and it become a new newspaper every issue because it would be banned by the government. I think that's hilarious. But yeah, the dictatorship, the military junta of Somoza in Nicaragua, was backed by the United States. There was an earthquake, and instead of, all this money was sent to Nicaragua to help the people suffering from the earthquake, and the people didn't get help. The regime, stole all the money, and people were left without help during this earthquake. It was a disaster. So, 1979, you had the escalation, and the Sandinistas went from being like a study group of like 30 people to being the ruling party and seizing power. It happened, right? That was the Nicaraguan Revolution. El Salvador, their revolution happened a similar way. And, all over Latin America, you had, in response to military juntas that were, backed by the United States, that were totalitarian, that exterminated communists with death squads. In response to that, you had armed guerrilla warfare in the countryside. And they quoted Mao, and they quoted Che Guevara, and that was what the Cubans were kind of seen as backing. That's why Cuba was designated by the U.S. government as a state sponsor of terror, because those groups that in Nicaragua and Colombia and all these places that were waging armed guerrilla warfare were designated by the U.S. government as terrorists, and they were all getting military support from Cuba, training and weapons and stuff. So Cuba was designated as a sponsor of terror. However, in the 90s, all of that changed. In the 90s, things changed very rapidly, in Latin America. Right? When you have a military dictatorship, see, this is what people don't get, right? When you have a military dictatorship, it doesn't represent the entire ruling class. It's Bonapartism. It represents one section of the ruling class, right? One section of the ruling class asserting its will against other sections of the ruling class. That's what happens when you have a military regime. And there's always people in the ruling class that don't like that military regime. They feel like it's not working in their interest. They feel like it's corrupt. They feel like it's dangerous. And they resent it. That always happens. When you have a military regime that takes power, it's not everyone wins out. Not the whole ruling class wins out. And that's how it was. Rios Montt in Guatemala, Pinochet in Chile. There were a lot of people in the ruling class who didn't appreciate the political atmosphere that took place there, right? And when the Soviet Union fell, right, and the ability of the Soviet Union and Cuba to support armed revolts drastically was reduced, at that point, when that happened, you, at that point, had a shift in Latin America, where it's fascinating, but like Bolivia, and a lot of these countries, you could have a more open, rule by consensus, liberal democratic structure in these countries. You could have a more classically free market capitalist country. And they started having free elections, late 80s, early 90s. Venezuela, Bolivia, places like that Argentina started having free elections. I haven't seen that movie, Lincolnite Yankee. I have not seen the movie Wandering Earth, but thank you. And, they just didn't have, at that point, free elections. So they started having them in the 90s when the threat of communist revolution wasn't there, because a lot of the ruling class didn't want to have a military junta run the country. And that's the reality. People don't like dictatorships. You don't have to be a communist to not like dictatorships, right? A lot of these people in all kinds of Latin American countries didn't like the military dictatorships. And with the threat of communist revolution gone, the Latin American countries could loosen up. They could start having more open societies. And that happened all over Latin America. You had a loosening, right? And in response to that loosening, the communists drastically reoriented their strategy. And Cuba, at that point, stopped supporting armed revolutions and oriented its supporters and people that were communists in all over Latin America to do the opposite of what they had been doing before. Instead of being in the countryside and trying to organize some armed revolt among the peasantry, it said to them, go into the cities and build a popular front. And they did that. Cuba hasn't changed. The world has changed. In the 80s, there were brutal military dictatorships, so communists had to organize. They had to take up arms to defend themselves, number one, and they had to organize in the countryside because the rural areas weren't safe. And in the 90s, it shifted. And the FARC in Colombia didn't change their tactics. They continued waging a rural war, and that's why Cuba stopped supporting them. Fidel Castro wrote some very, very scathing critiques of the FARC in Colombia. He didn't like them because he said that if you're waging an armed guerrilla war for that long, at that point, you're not going to take power, so militarism becomes a way of life, and he didn't respect that. But at this point, folks, Cuba, yes, it does support people in Venezuela that are pursuing a peaceful transition to socialism. It supports activists in Nicaragua and Bolivia and places, but it doesn't support armed violence anymore, right? Because it's not a necessity. And if those countries were to become brutal military dictatorships again, it's very likely that they would support people in fighting for their democratic rights and liberties. Communists always prefer a peaceful transition to socialism, right? That's just a fact. Read Marx, read Engels, they overwhelmingly prefer a peaceful transition to socialism. The question is it possible? Or will the ruling class become so violent that people have no choice to defend themselves? That's the issue. But people who go around calling for a violent revolution, people who fetishize violence and love guns and they want to LARP and pretend, that's not working class at all. And it's not scientific and it's not Marxist. Bolivia, at the time Che Guevara was there, I don't believe that Fidel Castro, I don't think he was ever involved in the death of Che Guevara, and the Cuban government does not admire the Cuban government does not acknowledge any big political disagreement between the two of them. And after the death of Che Guevara, that's when, the Tricontinental became essential. So I don't believe that Fidel Castro sold out Che Guevara. But thank you for your super chat, Neon Noir, and thank you for asking that question. Okay, folks, what else is new? What else is new? Oh, boy. Boy. What else is new, folks? Well, now, folks, it's an interesting trivia question that you can ask people. And most people do not know. But ask people. Who is the only country to have ever captured a U.S. Army general, a U.S. military general? It's the only country to have captured a member of the U.S. military that has the rank of general. And that would be North Korea. And the guy was William F. Dean. William F. Dean. And he was captured. He was captured by the government of North Korea. And he was eventually returned to the United States in a prisoner exchange. 1951 to 1953, 3 years dead. And the U.S. government told everyone he was dead, and North Korea kept saying, we've got him, and the U.S. government said, pay no attention to that, it's propaganda, he just died, don't pay any attention. He was captured by the North Koreans, and he was held in North Korea, and eventually he was returned to the United States. And what's interesting is this book, it didn't come out. He was returned to the United States in 1953. This book didn't come out until 1971. And it's quite an interesting book. I've been going through it. It's interesting. There's an entire chapter in this book called My Friend Wilfred Burchett. Now, do folks know who Wilfred Burchett is? Wilfred Burchett is a communist journalist from Australia. And he was known for writing books about the Korean War, about the Vietnam War, about China. He was a communist. He was like a communist journalist from Australia. And there is an entire chapter in this book about how William F. Dean loves Wilfred Burchett, what a great guy he was. They stayed friends after his captivity, right? He interviewed him when he was in captivity, but they stayed friends. Again, another thing in this book that is fascinating is he says in this book that even though he studied Marxism at the university, he studied Marxism when he was in the university, he did not understand it. And that it was in captivity that he actually understood Marxism. The North Koreans taught him what Marxism actually was. He basically admits that what he learned at the American university about Marxism was false, and he now understands it based on his captivity. And I'm going to read you a few paragraphs from this, because, again, don't get the wrong impression. This book is full of anti-communist and anti-North Korean statements, so I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I'm just going to read you a few paragraphs from this book. He's talking about communists and what the communists talked about. He said, racial prejudice was their principal stock in trade. Every captured Negro soldier or officer was subjected to extra pressure. Why should you fight for a country that treats your people so badly at home? Was the question they hammered at these men. Every time they got a hold of a bit of evidence of racial discrimination, especially from Negro prisoners, it was always brought to me with the query, what is your conclusion? Now, nowadays, you would think, okay, well, whatever. But this was in 1951. This is before Martin Luther King Jr., this is before the Montgomery bus boycott. He's in a prison camp, and the North Koreans are constantly talking about the oppression of African Americans in the United States. That's huge. What else does he say here? Another point is that though their labor unions... let me start again. Another point is that through their labor unions, American workers complain about and fight against labor-saving devices because they put men out of work. Under communism, everyone tries to devise labor-saving equipment because their work will be for all at all times. In the beginning, we will have to work harder than we would like, long hours, but it will all come out right in the end with everyone's labor being planned. No duplication, and no human being working for an individual rather than for society as a whole. Then there won't be excessive hours of labor, and each will receive his requirements. Right? Communists have been Andrew Yanging before Andrew Yang, right? The whole thing about automation and all of that. But you read this book, I mean, he doesn't come out and say it. He says a lot of anti-North Korean stuff. He doesn't come out and say it. But you kind of get the impression. The fact that he's good friends with Wilfred Burchett, the fact that he basically talks about the killing of civilians in here and how the killing of civilians by the U.S. government was so wrong and how we killed too many civilians. And, you know, this general who was captured by the U.S., by the North Korean military, they did a number on him. It sounds like even though he was the head of the U.S. Army, he was a general, sounds a lot like they were able to change his mind and change his worldview. Right? He talks about the Korean War and how bad the U.S. operated in there. He talks about the killing of civilians. He talks about mistreatment by the North Koreans, you know, holding him captured. But a lot, you read this, and he talks about what a great man Wilfred Burchett is, and I'm telling you, the fact this didn't come out until 1971, right? I mean, you know, I'm telling you, folks, they did a number on this guy. I wish this guy were still alive. I would want to go interview him. And I bet you this guy was very, very carefully watched when he came back to the United States. And I bet you before this book was published, the U.S. government people went over every line to make sure there wasn't anything that was too quotable. But even still, there's some stuff in here that's pretty quotable, right? Now, you know, he doesn't sound like a communist, doesn't sound like he's changed his position, but he says some things that are oddly positive about communists. I'll tell you that much. Fascinating. I think it's fascinating, right? It was a fascinating read for me. You know, I'll tell you, I have learned a lot from anti-communist literature. You can learn a lot from it, right? I mean, the amount of money the U.S. government has spent studying communists and studying their tactics and methods. There's a lot of books that are public record, that are studies of communists and studies of how they operate and all of that. They were obsessed with communism. The U.S. government still is, and that's the weird thing. The Soviet Union's gone. They're still obsessed with communism. They are obsessed with communists. And because of that, they have done all kinds of research, all kinds of academic investigations into communists and revolutionaries and what motivates them, why do they do it, how do they organize, how do they do what they do. Massive. And it's all, a lot of it is public record now. And honestly, I think you can learn a lot from it, right? I mean, you understand that this is the enemy studying you. You understand that this is the forces that don't believe in socialism, that are trying to hold off any movement towards socialism in the United States. But you read it. There's a lot of fascinating stuff there. I think it's fascinating. What's Israel-Samson plan mean for Arab socialism? I don't know what the Israel-Samson plan is. I'm sorry, Hades. I don't know what that is. So, I mean, Arab socialism, what I think is interesting is the term Arab socialism comes out of Egypt. Abdul Nasser coined the term Arab socialism. He said that Egypt was going to have socialism, but it wouldn't be Soviet socialism. It would be an Arab form of socialism. It would be Islamic, obviously, be rooted in Arab culture. Abdul Nasser was aligned with the Soviet Union, and it was with Soviet assistance. It was with Soviet assistance that Egypt became a fully electrified country. Abdul Nasser signed a deal with the Arab with the Soviet Union, and they built the dam, this huge electrical facility, the biggest power plant in the entire Middle East. And that was done. That was Arab socialism. Then Ba'athist Arab socialism, is a version. That was the Ba'ath movement had started in Syria. In Syria, you had Michel Aflaq, who was a member of the Syrian Communist Party. And when the Second World War happened, the orientation of Syria's independence movement and the communists in Syria was to not fight the French colonizers because France was anti-Nazi. The feeling was that in Syria, if you were being colonized by the French, well, you should just take it and do everything you can to defend the Soviet Union from the Nazis. And Michel Aflaq didn't agree with that. So he started another left-wing movement, which was called Ba'athist Arab Socialism. And Ba'ath means renaissance or rebirth or awakening in Arabic. And it was basically a call to, they talk about the Arab Enlightenment or the Arab Awakening or the Arab Renaissance that happened before the Renaissance in the Western countries. That's where we get Arabic numerals from. That's where a lot of great breakthroughs in astronomy happened, before they happened in Europe. And basically, the Ba'ath movement was a feeling that with socialism, they could once again restore the Arab people to being cutting-edge, great, advanced, modern people, right? And that it was the colonization by the West that was keeping them in primitive conditions, and that Wahhabism and the Saudi regime and the monarchies, those were holding back the Arab people. And that Baathism was the belief that with socialist methods, the Arab people could have a rebirth or an awakening or a new renaissance. That's what Ba'athist Arab socialism is. Michel Aflaq was from a Christian family. He joined the Communist Party of Syria, and in the Communist Party of Syria, he was an atheist. And then, as a Ba'athist, I don't know if he ever fully became a Muslim, but he believed that Islam was an example of the greatness of the Arab people, right? And that Islam, the way the prayers are organized, or they pray at the same time every day, and all of that, he thought it showed the brilliance of the Arab mind, and that Islam was an essential part of Arabism, and that Islam would play a big role in Baathism. But as is being pointed out by Will Lutz, Baathism is secular, right? In Iraq and Syria, which had Ba'athist governments, Christians were very prominent, right? Women had elected office, and that it wasn't, Baathism is secular, even though it recognizes that Islam is an essential part of the Arab identity. I think it's fascinating, but Ba'athist Arab socialism, you have Nasser's Arab socialism, you have Gaddafi, who rejected Arab socialism. He said he was an Islamic socialist, Qubbaist, right? That's the Gaddafi teaching. It's a different belief system. I mean, all this is very, very fascinating. Would you be willing to come to the UK and give a speech? I would love to come to the UK and give a speech. If you want to have me come to the UK and give a speech, let's make it happen. Message me privately. I have not been to the UK in a long time, since I was like 12 years old. You want to invite me, I'd be happy to come. So make it happen, right? Let's do it. Let's work out the details. I'll have to Google this Samson stuff. I don't know what it is you're talking about, but I'm having a great time. I'm having a great time. Now, Ramiro out in L.A., shout out to you, Ramiro, is saying that the vice president of Venezuela has a Ba'athist background. Fascinating. I think that's pretty fascinating. And, the relationship between Venezuela and Syria is very serious, and I think that's great. Oh, what else is we talking about, folks? We talked about William F. Dean. We talked about Iran. We've talked about all kinds of stuff. People wanted me to talk about Deng Xiaoping. I mean, I've done a whole class where I talk about Deng Xiaoping. I quote extensively from Deng Xiaoping in my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. You want to learn about Deng Xiaoping? City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, my book about socialism. If you want to know everything you need to know about Deng Xiaoping, I'm not going to read it to you on here, but starting on page 70 of my book, China's Great Adjustment, all the way to page 83. So that's 13 pages about Deng Xiaoping. That's everything you need to know. So if you haven't gotten a copy of it and you want to learn about Deng Xiaoping, order my book today. Turn to page 70, China's Great Adjustment, and read all the way to page 83, and you will have read more quotations from Deng Xiaoping, and you will understand China's economic system and how China fits into my thesis about socialism for the 21st century and the fall of the Soviet Union and what's going on. So check it out. That's what I recommend you do. That is what I recommend you do. And, there you go. Yeah, that's what I recommend you do, because there's a lot on there. I also recommend, I gave a class a couple weeks ago here in New York called Mao and American Socialists. And towards the end, I talked a lot about Deng Xiaoping. I think Deng Xiaoping is a very, very important figure. And then I was directly asked by someone in the audience named Sander, a friend of mine named Sander, shout out to you if you're watching. And he directly asked me, what is your opinion of Deng Xiaoping? And I said what my opinion is, which is, I think Deng Xiaoping is a very, very important figure in China's history. If Deng Xiaoping had not done what he did in 1978 with the reform and opening up, China probably would not have remained socialist. There would have been a counter-revolution, and that it was necessary to do the market reforms. However, I don't agree with his foreign policy. I think the Kampuchea War and the way China aligned itself in invading Vietnam and defending Pol Pot, and I don't agree with that. I don't agree with a lot of his foreign policy. In Afghanistan, his foreign policy, I think, was wrong, supporting the Mujahideen and terrorists against the Soviet Union. But his economic policies were correct, and his understanding of Marxism and how essential growth is, that growth was essential to Marxist theory. You cannot have Marxism without growth. That Marxism is about historical progress, right? That was absolutely necessary. The market reforms were absolutely necessary. Could they have been done differently? Perhaps. And China's been adjusting. I mean, China is constantly changing. Deng Xiaoping realized something. And he realized it, and thank goodness he realized it. That if you do not break, if you do not bend, you break. And Clarence Darrow is asking me about Saddam Hussein. But if you do not bend, you break. The Soviet Union in the 80s couldn't keep functioning the way it was functioning. It was stagnant. The whole system in the 80s, people weren't starving. It was economically better than it was in the 90s, but it needed to adjust, right? That they had set things up where there was some stagnation. The machinery, it was not working. They needed to adjust it. And they adjusted it in a way with perestroika and glasnost that destroyed the country. It didn't just destroy the socialist system and the Soviet Union, it destroyed Russia. I mean, millions of people, lost their lives or fled the country, or heroin addiction. It was a disaster. The Soviet system was unable to bend, and so it broke. Whereas China was able to bend, so it did not break. One of the best ways of putting it, and I put it this way in previous lives, and I'll get to the Saddam Hussein thing in a second. China figured out how to have socialism and sneakers. I made a whole video on this. I met a woman in Russia when I was over there. We had a conversation. She was telling me about how she thought the fall of the Soviet Union was a disaster. She remembers how hard the times were. But even in that period, even in the 90s, when the Soviet Union was falling and all that, she couldn't bring herself to vote for the Communist Party because she wanted to have sneakers. Right? Nike sneakers were the hip thing to buy, and under the Soviet system, no one had any sneakers. And the lure of Western capitalism was consumer goods. Right? That was the lure of Western capitalism, was consumer goods. Capitalism was saying, sure, in our system, people might be hungry. In our system, people might be starving, but you can drink Coca-Cola. You can wear Nike sneakers. You can have Beatles albums. And it's true. The Stalin model, socialism in one country, doesn't do too well with consumer goods. It's great at making steel, great at making electricity. It's great at industrial, heavy industry. It's great at even technological innovations, computers. The Soviets did computers amazingly well. No one ever gives them credit for that. But, the Soviets had a home computer very early on. Some people say the Soviets had developed what became a home computer before the Americans do. Some people contest that. I'm not a computer historian. But, the Soviet Union was very good at technological innovation, was very, very good at heavy industry. They knew how to run the steel mills, and they knew how to run power plants and all of that. They invented the first, mobile phone, in 1957. They were good at inventing stuff, but when it came to sparkly, shiny consumer goods, they weren't as good at it. You need marketing to develop sparkly, shiny, sexy Coke cans and Beatles albums, okay? You need a market sector. And China has figured out how to have socialism and sneakers. Now, is their socialism perfect? Far from it. And they know that. And there's constantly crackdowns on corruption. But China has figured out how to have both socialism and sneakers, how to have a market sector that is subordinated to the state. And if you look at China, from 1949 to today, there has been nothing but growth. Now, the growth significantly slowed down during the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, but they were still growing even during those times. And they have continued to grow because their economy is rationally planned. Their economy doesn't function according to profits, the preliminary transformation, right? It's not, things in China get done because the Communist Party wants them to get done. Even private companies, yes, they make a profit and all of that, but if the government shows up, they do what the government says, period, right? The state is in control of the economy. The Chinese economy is not profits in command. The Chinese economy is the Communist Party in command. They have 5-year economic plans. The rate of state ownership is massive. The steel industry is all government controlled. All these big corporations, Huawei and all of that, they're private, sure, but they're controlled by the state. They don't operate on the basis of making profits. They operate in accordance with state central plans. They get huge subsidies. China's not a capitalist country, and that has been the secret to their huge amounts of economic growth. Now, is there corruption there? Sure. Are there human rights violations there? Sure. And I'm not going to gloss over that. And I'm not going to tell you that you should just poo-poo that. I'm not going to tell you that there aren't bad things that have gone on there. Everyone I've ever met from China, even the most firm government supporter, tells me we have big issues with human rights. We have big issues with corruption. So don't try to paint me as a blind apologist for China. But I'm telling you, if you look at the economic model that China has had, no country in human history has ever experienced that much economic growth. Between 1978 and today, 900 million people have been lifted out of poverty. 900 million. It drives me crazy. PragerU, these idiots at PragerU, they go, since 1900, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. Oh, look how great capitalism is. Half those people are in China, you idiot. Unbelievable. And all these other people that are lifted out of poverty in Africa, in South America. I went to Brazil. People in Brazil are rising out of poverty. Why? Because Lula da Silva and the Social Democratic government of Brazil made contracts with the government of China and the government of Russia to start building huge hydroelectric power plants there. I mean, so how is that because of capitalism? A state-run Chinese economy cooperates with a social democratic government just to build all kinds of infrastructure all over Brazil, and that results in people getting electricity in remote parts of the Amazon who never had it, and as a result, they can start their own businesses and raise themselves out of poverty. How in the world is that because of capitalism? I mean, it's beyond me, right? Bolivia, right? If you look at what Evo Morales did, raising people out of poverty, with cooperation with China, in cooperation with Russia, right? Russia has done a huge amount to alleviate poverty in countries, in Africa. The Russian state-run corporations and mining corporations, they team up with local governments. They help them build state-run mining corporations. How in the world is this because of free market capitalism? There's not a shred of honesty in these PragerU people, right? I mean, it's just like how they make videos. The PragerU people do, right? All socialists are evil and retarded evil. And the next video, Martin Luther King was a great American. Hey, he's a socialist, you idiots. They're liars. They do not care about honesty and truth at all. They just say whatever is convenient for them. They're working for fracking companies. They're working for Bernie Marcus. They're working for Betsy DeVos, and they say whatever. There's not even any consistency in their propaganda. It's deceptive and it's inconsistent. Everyone knows capitalism is good. Everyone knows socialism is bad. And Trump is amazing. And we should all have a war with Iran because Iran is bad. And Russia is bad. And China is bad. And I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, they'll do a video about how socialism has never worked anywhere. And you reply to it and you go, China. And they go, oh, China's capitalist, you idiot. And then two videos later, they'll do a video about Hong Kong protesters being killed. See how evil communism is? You just said it's capitalist. You have to blame that on... There's no consistency. None. It's dumb neoconservatism. It's Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss said that Americans should be led to understand politics like an episode of Gunsmoke. Ever see Gunsmoke? It's a 1950s TV Western. And the good guy always wears a white hat, so you can tell he's the good guy. The bad guy always wears a black hat, so you can tell he's the bad guy. The good guy always wins, the bad guy always loses. And that's how it is. And these people, PragerU, it is exactly Leo Strauss. They think like Leo Strauss. I mean, they see the world the way Leo Strauss wants them to do. They think the world is an episode of Gunsmoke. And they walk around, and they've never heard the name Qasem Soleimani. They have no idea who Qasem Soleimani is. They don't know anything about the Middle East. And they hear Trump killed Qasem Soleimani, and they're like, yeah, the good guy won. Woo! And it's like, you say to them, Qasem Soleimani fought ISIS. They're, nuh-uh, Trump killed him, so he must have been an ISIS guy. He's like one of them Muslims over there. Yeah, woo! And you talk to them, and you're like, Iran hates ISIS. Nuh-uh, ISIS are bad and America's good, so Iran must be ISIS. They're idiots. These people are complete idiots. You talk to them, they're complete idiots. They don't know anything. They think it's like a movie. They think it's Leo Strauss. They don't get it. They don't understand that ISIS and Wahhabi ideology, that Osama bin Laden was a Saudi, that Wahhabi ideology, the Saudi teaching, that is who is killing us. That's who's killing us with the terrorist attacks. Not the Iranians, not the Shia, right? We are being killed actively. We are actively being killed by people with an ideology in a country that we give loads of weapons to and buy loads of oil from, and Trump goes around and dances with them at a party. Oh, boy. Sorry, folks. I'm getting fired up. That's why I shouldn't drink too much of this beverage. Only a little bit left. But it makes me mad. It makes me mad. Right? Someone's asking me, Jacob Maxey is now asking me about international forces at work in Libya. It's a disaster. It's a disaster. The main thing in Libya is trying to keep the country from falling apart. Right? And if something stable can emerge in Libya, right? If some kind of force in Libya can emerge that will stabilize the country, that will end the ethnic killing, and start raising people out of poverty again, that would be great. That would be very, very great. I remember briefly after the Libyan war, some faction seized control of an oil port and started sending oil to North Korea. Do you remember that? It was 2013 that happened, right? I mean, Libya has been a mess. Libya is the strongest argument against U.S. military intervention. Look at Libya now. And you know that Manchester bomber who blew up that concert in Manchester and killed all those innocent people? Did you know he was a Libyan? Did you know that he went to Libya and fought against Gaddafi alongside his father? And nobody talks about that. We hated Gaddafi so much because how dare he build, huge irrigation facilities? How dare he raise his people out of poverty? How dare he wipe out illiteracy? How dare he create universal employment? Oh, couldn't stand Gaddafi. He was bad. Gaddafi was bad. So the U.S. government armed the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda and all kinds of terrorists. And then one of those terrorists went to Manchester and blew up a concert and killed all kinds of innocent people. And I feel like I'm the only person who's smart enough to go, okay, have you realized we're on the wrong side in Libya yet? I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, it really is, right? And Libya's a mess. It's not just, there's all these factions that came into power. The Muslim Brotherhood, for example. The the various factions in Libya that came in and were fighting over Libya, fighting for the spoils after that war was over. I mean, it was just unbelievable. I mean, then they're killing each other, and it's a mess, right? And I know Russia is trying to help bring stability to Libya. I know China would like some stability in Libya. The USA, Wall Street and London want more chaos in Libya, and they want. I mean, and it's that's basically all they got, right? Is chaos and civil war, so they can stay on top of the world. And that changes things. And a lot of the Marxist narrative has been a longing for chaos. That's been one of the problems, right? Is that bohemian destructive psyche. People turn to socialism because it brings stability. Right? If you look at all the revolutions in history, they weren't made because people wanted chaos. They weren't made because people wanted violence. It was made because people wanted the violence to end. Right? The Russian people wanted to stop fighting in World War I. They didn't want to go and fight in World War I anymore. And furthermore, the provisional government and the factions and all of these unstable forces in Russia, right? You had the, Kornilov, General Kornilov trying to be the dictator, and you had all this instability. And the Bolsheviks had guns and were very well organized, and they were going to end the war. And people said, can you please take power, Lenin? Can you please take power and bring some stability to the country, please? That's how the Bolsheviks took power. Peace, land, and bread. They came to power on a platform of we will end the chaos. Not we're going to storm heaven and, people's war until communism. No. The Bolsheviks took power on a promise of bringing stability. The Chinese Communist Party took power on a promise of bringing stability. Right? Hugo Chavez took power on a promise of bringing stability. Socialism is not about creating chaos. It's about providing stability. And that middle class current, that bohemian trend, that desire, that adolescent rebellion dressed up as politics, that destructive impulse that gets acted out in a political way is a weakness. And it needs to be struggled against, honestly. Right? Communists are the bringers of order. They're the bringers of stability. And they bring stability to the economy. Right? That's ultimately what it's about. It's about abolishing the anarchy of production and organizing the economy to serve public good. That is the basis. That is the basis of what socialism really is, and people don't get that. Now, someone said to me there was weirdos in the chat. Well, every time we do this, there are weirdos in the chat. And as I've always said, don't feed the trolls. I'm not even seeing half the stuff that's coming through. Don't feed the trolls. If people are saying weird stuff, don't feed them, right? And just keep doing what we're doing. We're a community here. There's people here. It's a growing community. More people are coming in every week, and we keep doing our thing, and we're happy. So let's just, don't feed the trolls and keep the show on the road. Keep it going. Might want to go for a little while longer, folks. Might want to go for a little while longer. Elections. 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 We got an election coming up in the United States in the year of 2020. Tell me, folks, what do Marxists, socialists think about elections? Thank you, Kinky. Thanks for the super chat. What do Marxists and socialists think about elections? What do we think about elections? So here's a question. Can socialism be voted into existence? Can we vote socialism into existence? No. No, we cannot. Socialism is a huge, huge change in all of society. Socialism is the banks, factories, and industries being controlled by the people, the economy being completely organized to serve public good and not profits. That's what socialism is. And no, you cannot vote socialism into existence. You cannot do it. Right? It's a huge change. And a huge change like that, when a country goes from capitalism to socialism, especially a big country like the United States, but any country, it never can be accomplished merely by the results of a vote. And that's just a reality. Socialism cannot be accomplished merely by election results. So no, you cannot vote socialism into existence. But do elections play a big role in transitioning a country to socialism? You betcha. They can be a factor. But ultimately, it's not the election that determines it. It's millions of people being pushed into motion. Right? Venezuela didn't vote socialism into existence. Hugo Chavez took office because there was a huge mass movement. There was contradictions within the bourgeoisie. There was mobilizations and the oil market, and there was all kinds of factors. And yes, the election of Hugo Chavez was part of it. But no, socialism was not voted into existence in Venezuela. Right? Socialism was not voted into existence anywhere. Socialism has always been the result of millions of people being involved in the political process. Elections are part of that. And that's what's missing. You know, people give you this false dichotomy. You have to advocate a violent revolution, or you have to advocate elections as the road to socialism. Elections are part of the road to socialism, and advocating a violent revolution is childish and ultra-left. It is. So, how do Marxists and communists relate to elections? Well, the primary way, the number one way that communists and Marxists relate to elections is using them as advertising. Right? That's the primary way. Right? Most people in a non-revolutionary time and capitalist societies that have open elections, the only time they really think about politics, the only time they really think about politics, the only time is when it's election time. And trust me, I mean, you all know it, right? You think about politics, your friends might think about politics, but you all work with people, or you know people who just, they don't know what's going on. Politics to them is Trump or Hillary. And that's how, if you watch CNN, that's what you think politics is, right? Trump or Hillary, right? It's just who you voting for today. Who are the personalities? That's what politics is to most people. So, if communists want to influence most people, they have a responsibility to run candidates for office. And they've done that. Historically, they have done that. Eugene Debs was probably the most famous person who did it. Eugene V. Debs of the Socialist Party of America, right? He ran for president over and over and over again. In the 1912 election, he got almost 1 million votes. And that was at a time where the election was decided by like 6 million votes, so that was huge. The population of the USA was much lower, and women could not vote at that point. And Eugene Debs traveled around the country on a red train car, promoting socialism and running as a presidential candidate for the Socialist Party. And it had a huge, huge impact. Huge. That Eugene V. Debs did that he traveled around and ran for president as a socialist. Did he really have a chance of winning? No. But he was using it to advertise socialism. His electoral campaign was advertising. He was advertising and promoting socialism by traveling around on his red train car and promoting socialism. That's what Eugene V. Debs did. And that's one of the ways communists participate in elections. They use it as advertising. And William Z. Foster did this, Towards Soviet America. 1932, he wrote Towards Soviet America as his book. He traveled around the United States promoting what a Soviet America would be like, and he ran as a communist candidate for president, right? That's one of the ways communists participate in elections, is they use it as advertising, and people will take you more seriously, right? If someone shows up and says, hey, I'm a communist, I want to talk about communism, it's like, okay, bye-bye. Someone knocks on your door and says, hey, I'm running for city council, and I've got this platform. People will take you more seriously. Your neighbors, your coworkers, that participating in the electoral process brings you a level of respect, and it brings you a level of publicity. And that's one of the primary ways socialists have participated in elections. But it's not the only way. Sometimes there is an electoral campaign that is important to build a mass movement. Right? For example, Henry Wallace, 1948. Now, Henry Wallace was not a communist. He was the vice president under Franklin Roosevelt. He was a social democrat. He had been in the Socialist Party. He'd then been a Democrat, Secretary of Agriculture. But he wanted peace with the Soviet Union. He was opposed to McCarthyism. He was in favor of peace. He was anti-war. And he was supporting labor unions. And so in 1948, the communists were correct in supporting Henry Wallace when he ran for president as a third-party candidate, as the Progressive Party. He didn't win. He didn't have a chance of winning. But because the Democrats were so strongly in support of Jim Crow, because the Democrats were so strongly in support of the Cold War, and racism and McCarthyism, and Truman was using McCarthyism to purge the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Communists, it was necessary for them to support a campaign that was not a communist campaign, but was a campaign that would change American politics. Henry Wallace running, and the fact that over 1 million people voted for Henry Wallace in 1948, the Cold War is going on, the Korean War is getting ready to start, and 1 million Americans said, I don't agree with Jim Crow, I don't agree with the Cold War against the Soviet Union, I don't agree with the attacks on labor unions, I don't agree with anti-communist witch hunts and McCarthyism, and 1 million Americans went to the polls and punched their ballot for Henry Wallace. That was a good thing. It was a very good thing. There were millions more of Americans that wanted to do it, probably, but they couldn't. In the southern states, the Jim Crow states, they wouldn't let him on the ballot. But Henry Wallace, 1948 campaign, was not a communist campaign. But it was the right thing to do for communists to support it. It didn't have any chance of winning. But it was the only expression. It was a way to use the elections to express opposition to what both parties were doing. The Democrats were anti-communist witch hunters and McCarthyists and racists. The Republicans were racists, McCarthyist, anti-communist witch hunters, wanted war. So the only option to stand against the way capitalism in the United States was going one way, and Henry Wallace and the Progressive Party was going another way. And that's why William Z. Foster, that's why Gus Hall, that's why the Communist Party, that's why Paul Robeson, one of the first gay rights activists in the United States, Harry Hay, they formed Bachelors for Wallace. Every person with a progressive bone in their body supported Henry Wallace when he ran in 1948 for president, even though he didn't have a chance of winning. It was the only... Henry Wallace was standing there. He was a voice crying out in the wilderness, saying, I object. I am opposed to McCarthyism and the Cold War. I'm opposed to Jim Crow and racism. He was a voice crying out in the wilderness. Capitalism was going one way, he was going another way, and you had to support Henry Wallace. That's another example. When communists participate in elections, not to promote their own party, but to make a stand, to build opposition to the status quo. And there have been other presidential campaigns that have been like that, I think. I think Ralph Nader, some of his campaigns have kind of played that role. Ralph Nader's not a communist, but his campaign, stood in opposition to the way capitalism was going, right? And there are other examples of that, of campaigns that are not. I think Bernie Sanders is a lot like that. Now, Bernie Sanders, he is not a communist, not a socialist. I think there's a good chance he could win, so I'm not even going to say it's the same thing that he won't win, but his campaign stands in opposition, right? Capitalism is going toward bigger wars. Capitalism is going toward a bigger police state. Capitalism is going toward austerity and cuts in social spending, and everyone who's against it is running to his campaign. So the Bernie Sanders campaign is much like the Henry Wallace campaign. That's one way. But there's other ways that communists participate in elections. For example, in 1864, the USA was having the Civil War. 1864, and the USA was having the Civil War. And Abraham Lincoln was running for re-election. And he was running against a Democrat. And if the Democrats had won the election in 1864, they would have signed a peace treaty with the South. And slavery would not have been abolished. And in 1864, everything was done to make sure that Abraham Lincoln was reelected. And all the communists in the United States, August Willich, Joseph Wedemeyer, Samuel Gompers, I think, was a communist at that point, they moved heaven and earth to make sure that Lincoln won that election. Lincoln famously said, "You don't change horses midstream." And there was a party that was more radical than Abraham Lincoln. It was far left, right? They were called the Radical Democratic Party. They were free soilers, and they thought Lincoln wasn't anti-slavery enough. Marx told his supporters, just stay away from that, vote for Lincoln. And they did. They did in big numbers. They voted for Abraham Lincoln. Because that election, there was a divide among the American bourgeoisie, right? The South had broken away. There was a civil war going on. And most of the American bourgeoisie wanted to continue that war against the South. But Wall Street, that made money by ensuring cotton shipments to Britain and was tied in with the British Empire, wanted to end the war and keep slavery intact. And the Democratic Party, the Tammany Hall machine of New York City, were big supporters of Jim Crow, or of slavery. At that point, they were big supporters of the international slave trade tied in with Britain. They wanted to end the war. And so it was necessary for communists to move heaven and earth and do everything they could do to support Abraham Lincoln and make sure that he defeated the Democrats, he got reelected, and the South was defeated. That wasn't running to promote themselves. That wasn't an educational campaign. It wasn't running to build an opposition movement like Henry Wallace. It was running to win. It was, we are for one section of the bourgeoisie against the other. It was a popular front. They didn't have that terminology back then. That's what it was. It was a popular front. It was a popular front that they were running against slavery. And it was successful. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln was victorious, and Karl Marx sent him a glowing letter congratulating him on his victory. Let me make sure we're plugged in here. I don't want to have an electrical outage or something. There we go. And then another example, 1936. Franklin Roosevelt was running for re-election. And Franklin Roosevelt had just legalized labor unions, and Franklin Roosevelt had basically positioned the United States to align itself with Britain against the Nazis. And Franklin Roosevelt had recognized the Soviet Union and established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. And Franklin Roosevelt was passing all kinds of progressive legislation and building power plants. And the majority of the capitalist class, of the billionaires and bankers in the United States, wanted to remove Roosevelt from office. And Roosevelt said, I welcome their hatred. I welcome their hatred at Madison Square Garden. And the Communist Party of the United States, they ran an election campaign Earl Browder ran for president, but he told everyone, don't vote for me. Vote for Roosevelt. The essence of our campaign is to defeat the Republicans, and that was the correct thing to do. I'm not a big fan of Earl Browder, but his position in the 1936 elections was correct. He ran a communist campaign to get the communist message. But the communist message was democracy or fascism, build a people's front, and support Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was very flawed in a lot of ways. I'm not going to get into that. But in 1936, just like in 1864, communists participated in the elections for the purpose of supporting one candidate over the other. It was a popular front. They were in an alliance with one section of the bourgeoisie against another. Right? That was the case. And another way communists participate in elections is they boycott them. That's another thing that happens, right? When a country's in a revolutionary situation, right? When they have two governments, the communists will say, hey, we've got our dual power structure here. We've got our workers' government. We're boycotting your election. We have our own election. That happens too. There are different situations. Sometimes communists support the Democrats. Sometimes communists support the Republicans. Sometimes communists build progressive third parties. Sometimes communists run in their own name in order to promote themselves. Sometimes communists boycott elections. There is no holy book. There is no sacred rule about what you should do in terms of elections. Every case is decided based on what is best for advancing socialism and advancing the working class. Sometimes you vote for Democrats, sometimes you vote for Republicans, sometimes you vote for third parties, sometimes you build your own communist party, sometimes you boycott the elections. It's about what is best in the country at that time. Marxism is not religion. Marxism is a science. And it's about what will advance the people, what will advance the working class at that time. So, there you go. There you go. What else is on people's minds, folks? What else is new? What else is new, folks? I'm having a great time. I'm doing well. Oh, wow. There was one thing I was going to talk about on this live. I stay away from gender issues for the most part. I do. I really do. But I noticed that, Jason Unruhe, who, he doesn't agree with me. I don't agree with him, but he's a popular guy on YouTube, just like me. I noticed that Jason Unruhe did a video on masculinity and that question. And I noticed that a lot of my fans really liked a video I did on the question of masculinity and labor militancy. So I wanted to talk a little bit, very briefly, about gender issues. Just a couple points I want to raise. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't like that issues of gender dominate leftist discussions. I think that I've seen so many groups fall apart just over these kind of questions, and that's not what I'm here to do. But I'm going to touch on gender just a little bit. First of all, does toxic masculinity exist? Yes, it does. Absolutely does. Folks, let me tell you a story. When I was a kid, my grandfather raised sheep. He raised sheep. And, my grandfather was a great man. I really admire my grandfather. And he fought in the Second World War against the Japanese imperialists. And I remember, he went to the university, one of the first people in his family, I think, to go to university. And he studied agricultural science, and he actually was on the agricultural board of the state of Indiana at one point. He was a high-ranking bureaucrat of the agricultural board of the state of Indiana. It wasn't that when I knew him. He was an old man. He was retired when I was a kid. But I remember that my grandfather, he supplemented his income his whole life by raising sheep. I remember going out to the barn with him, and we would feed the sheep when I was staying at my grandfather and grandmother's place. And I remember the sheep, they're all in a flock, and you walk into the barn, and as soon as you walk in, they're like terrified of you, so they go, "Bah," and they go to the other side of the barn. And then you take the feed and you go to like the trough where you feed them, and then they see you and they like run to the other side of the barn, and they run to the other side of the barn. It's kind of funny. But anyway, I remember when my grandfather raised sheep, he would often have a ram. A ram. And a ram was a male sheep that had not been castrated. There were male sheep, but most of them were castrated. But a ram was a male sheep that had not been castrated. And so it had lots of testosterone. And rams, as you probably are aware, grow horns. And the ram always had to be in a separate pen from the other sheep. And that separate pen was far, far more fortified because rams are very strong and they can't be with the other sheep because they're out of control. Toxic masculinity is something that we have always known about as human beings. It's something we've always recognized. Why does the devil in Christian, paintings and art have horns? Why does the devil have horns? Why? Who has horns? Rams have horns. Bulls have horns. Right? Toxic masculinity. Animals are not people. Animals are not people. They don't have our level of intellect. And the bull, the ram, is toxically masculine. It is. I mean, and we've known this throughout all of human history. The oldest work of art, the oldest poem in all of human history is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't know if people have ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it is ancient Mesopotamia. And what does Gilgamesh, the hero, who's a man, but he's not toxically masculine, what does he do? He fights a giant bull. The bull of heaven. And he kills the bull. And he's explaining to his followers that the bull is an animal. And it's big and strong. And it's mighty. But he has human intellect and reason. And so he is able to kill this big, mighty bull. But he doesn't kill a big, mighty cow. He doesn't kill a big, mighty steer that's been castrated. It's a big, mighty bull. The bull, the ram. We've always understood that toxic masculinity is a thing. When men are controlled by their sexual desires, when men are controlled by their aggression, right? When they give up their humanity, when they become vile, aggressive, sexual creatures, and we've seen that. You know what I'm talking about. That is toxic. And it's destructive to human civilization. And that's why the devil has horns on his head, is he's toxically masculine. You're not toxically masculine if you take responsibility. You're not toxically masculine if you strongly stand up and say what you believe. You're not toxically masculine if you... No. Toxic masculinity is when human beings that are male reduce themselves to behaving like animals. They become like the bull. They become like the ram. And they are completely governed by their aggressive tendencies and their sexuality. That is toxic masculinity. And human civilization has been defined by us struggling against toxic masculinity. When I was in college, I've told this story before. I remember, I went to a certain college in Ohio, but before I went there, I toured another college in Cleveland, at Cleveland State University. I just toured there. I didn't end up going there. But on the college tour, I toured the dorm. And they told us on the dorm tour, they said, here at the college, we have mixed men and women's dorms, and we have all women's dorms. And I, being a constant questioner who can never just let anything go, raised my hand and said, why don't you have all men's dorms? I'll never forget this. The tour guide, who was a woman, said to me, because we don't like having the furniture broken. We don't like having the furniture broken. Yes, men, all by themselves, young men early 20s, late teens, living together all by themselves, sometimes destroy furniture. That's toxic masculinity. That is men acting like bulls. That is men acting like rams. And then the college I actually went to did have all men's dorms. It did. And I remember living in all men's dorms. And I remember seeing furniture get broken. And I'm laughing about it because, but it's not funny. Toxic masculinity. Men who are governed by their anger, aggression, and sexuality are bad. And there's nothing feminist about saying that. There's nothing left-wing about saying that. This is something we have always recognized, that men have a responsibility to control their testosterone, to not act like bulls and rams, to start acting like humans. There's a difference between human beings and animals. Rams should act like rams because they're animals, right? And then human beings have the ability to overcome that. And that's the difference. That is the difference. But toxic masculinity is something that has always existed, and it is a reality. But it's the nature of humanity. Going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, has been an effort to control that. But there is non-toxic masculinity, and that needs to be talked about as well. If you read about Joe Hill, you read about Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath. You read about socialist literature. Socialist literature is full of non-toxic masculinity. Masculinity itself is not toxic, but there is a such thing as toxic masculinity. But what it really is human beings who are male renouncing their humanity and reducing themselves to animals. And this has always been understood throughout all of human civilization to be evil. And that's why Satan in ancient, and up until today, Satan is portrayed as a human being who's walking around with horns on his head. Because he's toxically masculine. He is not in control of his sexual desires or his aggressive tendencies. Satan is toxic masculinity, the bull, the ram. This is what toxic masculinity is. That's the situation there. That's what you need to understand, right? That human beings have always understood this, and I'm repeating myself, but I think it's an important point that needs to be made. Right? It's an absolutely important point that needs to be made. I watched a documentary years back where they were talking about teen culture. And they used the word mook, M-O-O-K, mook. And mookishness is something that's been actively promoted. That's the crazy thing. Now, there is this big pushback against quote-unquote toxic masculinity in American media. In the 90s, in the early 2000s, U.S. media was pushing quote-unquote toxic masculinity like crazy. American Pie is an entire movie that is nothing but a celebration of toxic masculinity. Young men who are obsessed with sex and engage in disgusting behavior. You know what I'm talking about if you've seen the movie, and if you haven't, don't waste your time. You don't need to know. That American Pie was the teen movie when I was in high school, and it's disgusting. Animal House. All this stuff. It's all toxic masculinity. That is toxic behavior. When men are motivated purely by their desire for violence and purely by their desire for sex. That is toxic masculinity. When men are reducing themselves to animals, what do male animals do? They fight and they have sex. And when men reduce their identity to fighting and to having sex, that's toxic masculinity. And it is something that every man should struggle against. And I will say, let me add, that it's not completely fair to blame this on athletes. Now, that's a mistake. Sure. Okay, sure. We all know about quote-unquote jock culture, and athletes have a bad reputation. But to be a real athlete, to be an Olympic athlete, to be a professional athlete, requires you to use your brain. Right? Think about it. People that are good enough at their sport, they're good enough Olympic runners, they're good enough to be a professional football player, they have to be intelligent enough to understand themselves and train themselves to reach that high level of athletic prowess. You can't be stupid and be a professional athlete. You can't be stupid. You cannot be stupid and be an Olympic gold medalist. You can't. Right? That, yes, I mean, you can be stupid and play high school football. You might even be able to be stupid and play college football. I don't know. I never interacted with those folks too much to know them well enough. But to be a really serious athlete requires a high level of intelligence. Right? A serious athlete, to be good enough that you are one of the select few people. All kinds of people play sports. All kinds of people play sports, right? I mean, sports is like it grows on trees, right? Especially in the United States. Football, it's like, especially in like little towns like I grew up in, no one talks about anything but football all day long, right? So anyone can play sports. All kinds of people play sports. But to be good enough, to be a professional athlete, requires one to be intelligent enough, or at least work with people who are intelligent enough that you can train your body to go the extra limit. So I don't think it's fair that people put toxic masculinity on athletes. I don't think that's totally fair. I think, there might be some things that people can say, but ultimately, I think that if you meet professional athletes, people who've won gold medals, you're not going to be talking to toxically masculine people. You're going to be talking to people who've used their minds enough to manipulate their bodies enough to do amazing accomplishments. I could never do anything like that, right? And that's the thing. So toxic masculinity certainly exists. I'll give you that. And that I think that Western civilization, and that's a big word, Western civilization, right? That's a big thing like alt-right people try to use. I shouldn't say that, I guess. I'll say Western countries. Western countries, they have a crisis now because they don't know what to do about men. And this is very apparent. They don't know what to do about men. They realize that they don't know what to offer men. What does it mean to be a man in a Western country? They don't have an answer. They're wrangling with the answer. They don't like Trump. Very much appeals to masculinity. He does. They don't like Trump. The majority of the ruling class doesn't like Trump. And I feel like there's a lot of articles being written in popular culture. There's a lot of popular YouTube videos. There's all kinds of stuff trying to wrangle with what is the masculinity we want to promote, right? A lot of people on the internet just hate, a lot of leftists just hate men, right? I mean, and that's trendy in leftist circles to be like, oh, men are awful. Screw you, white man. But there's a lot of white men in the United States. There's a lot of men of color in the United States. I mean, you have to have something for men to do. Masculinity. You're going to have, male chromosomes in society, right? So men have to exist. What is the West going to do about men? What role do men have? And you can see this. There's a whole lot of confusion about this. They're wrangling. Trump, a lot of men Trump appeals to men, right? There's a feeling among a lot of the culture that just the way men are, the way boys are when they're growing up, the way men are, is just wrong, and men just need to just go away. Well, they're not going to go away. I'm sorry. I mean, we're 50% of the human population. Men are not going to go away. So what do you do about it? What do you do with men? And they don't know. The ruling class of the United States has no clue what to do about men. They don't know what to do, right? Trump is using male resentment. Trump very brilliantly, I'm not saying I agree with Trump, but I'm just telling you, he brilliantly manipulated male resentment in order to win the office, right? Hillary Clinton, right, is an awful, evil person who's extremely hateable. And he channeled that anger at her into kind of an anger that a lot of men have about the way culture is becoming. And Trump is very much, he's a wealthy man, he's crass, and he appeals to this kind of desire in an age where there's this feeling that somehow all masculinity is toxic. Donald Trump got up there and said, I'm toxically masculine, grab her by the and it was a pushback against this this rejection of all masculinity. In a lot of ways, you can interpret the Trump election as a pushback against this feeling that men just shouldn't exist. But of course, what did Trump use it for? For anti-immigrant bigotry, grab her by the, that's not acceptable. Not acceptable at all. I mean, Trump is a misogynist. Some of the things he said are just awful and nasty and horrific. I mean, there's no indefensible statements he's made about women. But he harnessed a resentment that has developed among a lot of men. And a lot of women voted for Trump. Let's not get this wrong. A lot of white American women voted for Trump because they, for whatever reason, respect this masculinity that's fading away. It's complicated. It's very, very complicated. I feel like the obsession all of a sudden with Mr. Rogers. Have you noticed that? They made a documentary about Mr. Rogers. Now they got the movie with Tom Hanks. And it's like they're trying to put up Mr. Rogers as the ideal man, Can you say I'm special? It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. They're putting up Mr. Rogers. It's like they're trying to have Fred Rogers, the children's TV star, be like the ideal of what a man is. I don't think that's going to work, folks. I'm not saying that there weren't great things about that individual. He did a lot to help a lot of kids, but I don't think you're going to channel all men in the United States who have resentment or confusion about what it means to be a man into becoming Mr. Rogers. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Right? We're wrangling with this question. We're wrangling with it. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a man? Number one. And what is U.S. society going to do to control men? How are men going to be channeled? This is something they're trying to figure out. They don't know what the answer is. They don't know what the answer is. They don't know how to relate to men in the United States. Western countries, USA, UK, Britain, have a big issue with men. They don't know what to do with men. And I want to make that point. I want to make that point, absolutely. That point needs to be made. And I hope that my point has come across. I hope I made some sense here. But there you go. What else is new, folks? Time is running out. What else is new? What else is new, folks? Caleb, this live stream is being monitored. Well, of course it's being monitored. Everything we do is being monitored, I'm sure that what I'm saying, there are people who, and that's the thing, I talk about in among all of you that are watching right now. I divide you all into three categories. There are fans. I love you, fans. You know who you are. There are haters. And I know who you are, and you leave comments and curse me out and, troll and do all kinds of nasty things. You're welcome here. Fine, whatever. I encourage people not to react to you, but you're there. And there are a lot of people that are lurkers. Lurkers. And thank you, Simran, for that super chat. There are a lot of people that are lurkers. Lurkers. You watch me. You don't leave comments. You don't leave comments. You don't really want me to know that you're there. And you really don't want other people to know that you're there. And I have a feeling I know who some of you are. I'm not going to say too much about it, but I'm starting to gradually piece together who some of you are, who some of you lurkers are. I think there are different kinds of you lurkers. There are a couple demographics of you lurkers. Through some research and interactions, I get little insights into who the lurkers are. There's lots of you. There are lots of you lurkers. The last couple lives we did, okay, so we're doing Jeffrey Sachs and Saddam Hussein. All right. The last couple lives that we did, there were at least 1.5K unique views. There are over 1,500 people that watched these conversations, at least, right? The total view counts was way over 2,000 on both of the last two. There are a lot of you out there. And I have a feeling I know who some of you lurkers who don't say anything are. And you're welcome here. And I understand you need to be private. I understand that you can't be, advertising for whatever reason that you're watching this. And that's okay. I forgive you for that. I don't even need to forgive you. I understand it. And I'm glad you're here, right? And I'm glad you're here. I urge you to not give in to the pressure, and I urge you to keep watching. Even if you don't agree with what I'm saying, even if you find it threatening to your worldview, keep watching. You're welcome here. I have a lot of friends who don't agree with me. But you're here. I'm glad you're here. So just keep listening. So now, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein took power in Iraq. He did a lot in terms of economic development of Iraq. He was a Ba'athist Arab socialist. I think that the way he conducted himself during the Iraq-Iran war was wrong. I think there were some problems with his leadership, but I do think that under his leadership, Iraq definitely was socialist. So that's really all I can say about it. I think there were some things he did that were highly problematic, but I also think that, he was an Iraqi nationalist. He was an Arab nationalist. He was trying to build up the economic development of Iraq. And the U.S. government played Iraq and Iran against each other. And that was very unfortunate. The fact that these two great countries in the Middle East were basically there were times they were basically being played against each other, and lots of people died, and it was wrong. And the Iraq-Iran war was a horrendous disaster, and millions of people died. And U.S. media pretended it wasn't even happening. Basically, while it was happening, millions of Iranians died, millions of Iraqis died, and the U.S. government, at one point they were arming Saddam Hussein. At one point they were arming Iran. We know about the Iran-Contra, and let's be real, folks, that it was a disaster. And U.S. media pretended it wasn't happening, and a lot of people died. And it was a horrendous occurrence. And this is Brzezinski. It's Brzezinski, right? That's what he figured out how to do, just to play anti-imperialists against each other. Shia Muslims, deeply religious, Iraqi Ba'athist Arab socialists, very, very secular, and playing people against each other. And it was horrendous. And everyone in Iran has a relative who died in that war, right? And village, every town, you'll see pictures of the martyrs who died in that war. It's horrendous. It's horrendous stuff. We can't relate to it. And again, I don't want to get all into the Iran stuff again, but we don't understand that. And again, it's time to grow up. We think we know what revolution's about. We think we know it. We don't. I've glimpsed it. I don't really know what it's about, honestly, but I've glimpsed it to some degree. I don't really understand it. But there's a reason to not be childish. There's a reason to not LARP. There's a reason to not act stupid, because this is real life, and the time for speaking falsely, the time for being childish, the time for burning the American flag and beating your chest and trying to be the most revolutionary and dress in revolutionary costumes is over, right? This is real life, folks. And for a lot of people, this is real. And the Iraq-Iran war was a horrendous thing. Two anti-imperialist countries fought each other, and millions of people died, and it shouldn't have happened. It should not have happened. And the scars and wounds of the Iraq-Iran war are still all over Iran. I've never been to Iraq, but I'm sure that they're still there. So that's all I got to say about that. Now, the other question I was asked about, Iraq-Iran, Saddam Hussein, and then what was the other? Oh, Jeffrey Sachs. So Jeffrey Sachs was a neoliberal economist, right? He was a neoliberal economist. He worked with, the USA, and he was all over Eastern Europe pushing privatizations. He was all over Bolivia. He was the butcher of Bolivia, and he helped Bolivia achieve Pinochetism without Pinochet. But he's started to change, right? He's starting to say that the World Bank and the IMF are too neoliberal, that neoliberal economics has proved that it has flaws, and he's talking a more liberal game now. And he's actually a Bernie Sanders supporter. Well, I don't think he's a Marxist. I think he's a Keynesian. But I think that because he was overseeing economic neoliberalism and pushing it like crazy, that was his whole career out of Columbia University School of Economics. He was Mr. Neoliberalism. That's who Jeffrey Sachs was. He was Mr. Neoliberalism. And I think that he sees the results of it, and he is tied in with more managerial elements of the ruling class of the United States that think there needs to be a more stable system, right? And that's what, if you read, the Council on Foreign Relations came out with a whole issue of Foreign Affairs in 2014 called The Social Democratic Future of America. And again, they realize, Andrew Yang, they realize that things have gotten a little bit out of control. And Soros and Andrew Yang and some of the wealthier are saying, okay, we need to try to stabilize this a little bit more. social programs, healthcare. We need to stabilize this. They realized that. And there's a section of the ruling class that thinks in a more managerial way and not an purely entrepreneurial way. And I think that that's the division, right? Trump represents the entrepreneurial capitalists, whereas there is a managerial wing that is much more managerial, and I think Sachs is tied in with that wing that is pursuing more Keynesian options to try and stabilize things, right? That's my feeling about all of that. But there you go, folks. What do I think is going to happen at the U.S. presidential election? I mean, folks, my prediction has been that Trump will win. And as it looks right now, I still think Trump is going to win. However, that could change. It really depends a lot on what the Democrats do. If they nominate somebody who, I mean, things could change. But as it looks now, my prediction is that Trump will be reelected. I think that's very, very, very likely. I think the overwhelming chances are that Trump will win the next election. But I could be wrong. I mean, things could very, very dramatically shift. Trump seems to be in this weird situation where he is constantly trying to keep the sections of the ruling class that are on his side. And they keep getting upset with him. And he'll pull the troops out of Afghanistan and go, oops, I didn't mean that. And he'll do this, and then he'll kill Qasem Soleimani, and then he'll do, I mean, it seems like Trump is having difficulty keeping his own house in order. And if Trump somehow doesn't play his cards right, and a big section of his camp defects, he very well could lose. So the issue is, it's not even really an issue of who the Democrats nominate. I think that's a part of it, right? If the Democrats nominate somebody that's not charismatic and they do what they did in 2016 again, I mean, Hillary Clinton's not running, but if they do what they did in 2016, yeah, don't count on it. But, if the Democrats nominate somebody with charisma, and if Trump somehow manages to screw up his own coalition, he could very well lose. We remember that basically what won the election for Trump. I don't know if folks recall this, but right before the election of 2016, there were some big shifts that happened. It was the last minute. The FBI reopened the investigation against Hillary Clinton and had a press conference. That was political, right? And the FBI, a lot of Mormons. Glenn Beck, big Mormon who had been supporting Ted Cruz and had been actually basically telling people not to vote for Trump. The Ted Cruz camp, at the last minute, the Mormon, Ted Cruz, Republicans who hate Trump, last minute, they all got on board, and then FBI, a lot of Mormons there, they reopened the investigation. Trump made some kind of deal, right? You remember that in Utah, in the state of Utah, right, the Mormons had gone as far as running a candidate of their own on the ballot for the Christian Freedom Party and telling the Mormons not to vote for Trump. The Mormon church was telling people not to vote for Trump and vote for the Christian Freedom Party, and some CIA guy named Ewan something McKellen, or I don't even remember what his name was, but they were telling to vote for this ex-CIA college professor. And at the last minute, the Mormon church told their members not to vote for him and to give the electoral votes of Utah to Trump. Glenn Beck, who had been critical, all of a sudden was telling people to vote for Trump. FBI reopened the investigation. James Comey reopened the investigation. At the last minute, Trump made some kind of deal that got him over the edge, and he won. What was that deal? I don't know what it was, right? And it may have been that these forces just realized that Trump was going to win, and maybe they just figured, okay, we don't want to, we better jump on board. But regardless, we remember that Comey and the FBI flipped almost immediately. Right, and so, it's not clear what happened, but there was the week before the election, there was a shuffle where it seemed like a lot of the forces in the American ruling class that had been very hostile to Trump suddenly flipped and were for Trump, and that was because something changed. Trump had made some kind of an alliance and all of that, and that's really what is essential to Trump. If Trump can keep his alliance together, if he can keep his alliance, right? He's got, Sheldon Adelson, Likud party supporters in Israel. He's got, Bernie Marcus, Betsy DeVos. He's got the fracking companies. He's got certain constituencies And that's the Trump coalition is so broad. I mean, it is so many different factions. I mean, my goodness, how many? I mean, you wonder if they agree on anything. I mean, you got Steve Bannon, you got isolationists, you got people that don't want any intervention, you got military. I mean, it's all over the place. But if Trump keeps losing them, he keeps losing them and then getting them back. And it's a constant negotiation. The Trump White House has about 16 different positions on things. It's got like 16 different factions in there. He hires John Bolton, fires John Bolton, I mean, it's a bizarre coalition. But if Trump can keep everything in order and can keep the faction, the solid support of his faction of the ruling class, he can probably win the White House. And if the Democrats nominate somebody who's not charismatic, he can win the White House. Again, for another 4 years. However, let me add that if Trump can't manage his own camp effectively, number one, and if Trump, on top of that, goes up against someone like a Bernie or somebody else, I mean, there's others, who just have the ability to play in, to cut into some of the anti-establishment street cred that Trump has, the I'm going to drain the swamp, if they can get somebody who seems radical and fired up, and the Democrats can look like they're actually going to do something, right? And if the Democrats can actually look like they're going to change things if they get in there, the Democrats can give themselves a facelift at their convention in Milwaukee and change what they're about and stop looking like the party of business as usual. And if Trump can't control his own faction and loses support with his own faction, the Democrats will win. But barring those two things, the chances of the Democrats actually getting their shit in order, ooh, I just said shit. No. But the chances of the Democrats getting their shit in order are not too good, number one. The chances of Trump actually screwing up his electoral coalition is also very slim. But if both of those things happen, Trump will lose. If one of those things happens, I think Trump will probably still win. But if both of those things happen, then Trump will lose. Right? It will take both of those things. The Democrats have to nominate someone who's charismatic, number one. And number two, Trump has to lose control of his coalition. And he keeps doing that consistently. I mean, every day it seems to change. The White House alliances are constantly shifting. So both of those things are very possible. It's very possible the Democrats could nominate and run an effective campaign. And it's also very possible that Trump could lose control of his coalition. Both of those things happen, the Democrats win. Barring those things, Trump has got it in the bag. If the election was held today, Trump would win. Hands down. I can tell you that. If the election was held today, Trump would win. No question. So we just have to see what happens. But at the moment, I would say 80% chance Trump will win the election. But it's Iowa's not even happened yet. So who knows what could happen, right? Who knows? So that's where I'm at. That's my prediction. But, I mean, hey, we'll be checking in about this as this goes on. That Elizabeth Warren-Bernie fight was the stupidest thing I have ever seen. It's the stupidest thing I have ever seen. That whole thing was so stupid. I mean, Elizabeth Warren lied and said that Bernie told her not to run as a woman. And, oh my goodness, that was so stupid. That whole thing was so, and it was my whole Twitter feed for like the last week. I'm thinking like we're on the brink, war's happening, the Russian government is being completely reshuffled. And and this is what my Twitter feed is talking about. I mean, I tweeted about it a little bit, but it was so dumb. And it just shows that the opposition to Bernie Sanders is not small. The forces that are opposed to Bernie are not weak, right? Bernie Sanders, they think he's a threat. I'm being asked what I think about Tulsi Gabbard. There are things about Tulsi Gabbard I really like. Her foreign policy positions are more advanced than any other Democrat. She's better than Bernie on foreign policy issues. She's been locked out of the debates. They don't like her. But I think she also represents, as I've said many times, she represents a faction within the Pentagon and the military There are a lot of people in the military who are saying, why are we acting like Al Qaeda's air force? Why are we on the wrong side in Syria? Why are we making enemies out of the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese instead of Al Qaeda? Why are we cuddling up to Saudi Arabia? There's a lot of people. It's almost like they have to have her in the election to give that opinion voice. Those people who feel that way have to feel like there's someone to vote for. Um, she's not a socialist. She's not a socialist. She's not a communist. I mean, she has a history of being very Islamophobic and whatever. But overall, I mean, she's improved on some of the issues, and some issues she hasn't improved. She's a great, I mean, and she's a good candidate. I don't think she's going to win. They're not even letting her in the debates. She's a lot like Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang is a similar thing. I feel like Andrew Yang's campaign is kind of a nudge over universal basic income, and it's about pushing a message and warning about the population rising. I like Andrew Yang, a lot of what he says. I don't agree with his solution, but I like what a lot of what he says. I like a lot of what Tulsi Gabbard says about foreign policy. Don't agree with everything she says. I like a lot of what Bernie Sanders says about the economics of the United States and the rule of the rich and all that, but I disagree with him about a lot of foreign policy stuff and a lot of other things. As a journalist, I don't endorse any candidate. I do not endorse any candidate, right? Number one. And, there you go. I will say that Joe Biden, aside from the fact that he's gotten all senile, right, and he's making all these inappropriate racial statements, Joe Biden's persona, the Joe Biden persona is probably, in terms of beating Trump, the most winning persona, right? That masculine working class guy, if I mean, at this point, Joe's got Alzheimer's. I don't know how his family are letting him stay in the race. I mean, my goodness. I mean, some of the stuff, keep the record player on and all this. I mean, the guy needs to retire. I mean, that's just embarrassing. But his persona is very effective. Policies, not so much. Career record, not so much. But his persona, which I guess it may be fading away in the elderly, confusion, but if it was simply a race about, if there was no issues at all, if it was what personality would defeat Trump, I think that personality that Joe Biden has is probably the most effective. But there's a whole lot of baggage there, and his son, Hunter Biden, and it's not going to happen. He wouldn't beat Trump, I don't think. But that personality, I think that personality, that Joe Biden personality, would be the most effective in undermining Trump's base. Bernie's personality is good, but he comes he's a little bit, the accent, he's that Brooklyn accent, and he looks so old, and it's hard for Bernie to present himself as a tough, tough dude, right? It's like that persona, I like Bernie's persona. I think a lot of people do. They see him as grandfatherly, a quirky old man, like Albert Einstein or something, and, and it works with younger people. I think a lot of younger people really like Bernie, but who knows? Tulsi Gabbard, she's running her campaign. Yang is running his campaign. Is there anyone else in the election who's worth talking about? I mean, Elizabeth Warren, it's possible, okay? There is a little bit of charisma there. A little bit. But the Pocahontas thing, and now this latest with Bernie, she's starting to set off Hillary Clinton vibes that are going to turn people off. But there's a little bit there. She's better than Hillary Clinton in terms of, the personality. She's a little bit more charismatic, I think. Is there anyone else worth mentioning? Not Tom Steyer, not Amy Klobuchar. I mean, these Democratic debates are hard to sit through. They're painful. I mean, these Democrats are, they're gonna bore the U.S. public into voting for them by running the most boring debates ever, and everyone will be so bored they're gonna vote for the Democrats to make the debates stop or something. I mean, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. But yeah, it is what it is. So that's kind of my feeling on the whole thing. I mean, these debates are like impossible to get through. They're just you just want to fall asleep. They're so bad. I mean, they're just so bad. And the foreign policy stuff is just unbelievable. It's like they just want to demand everyone pledge allegiance to hostile aggression around the world. And if they don't, well, it's pretty awful. And Rachel Maddow and the role that she's played, asking Andrew Yang, where have we ever meddled in elections? Where have we ever done that, Andrew? Where? I mean, it's like, come on. She used to work for Air America. She knows better than that. I'm not a big fan of Rachel Maddow. Not a big fan of hers at all. The way she's conducting herself and the whole Russia thing. And, oh, man, she is really, I think, when her show first went on the air, at the beginning, like around the time Barack Obama got elected, I think her heart was still in it. I think she still believed in what she was doing. And it's been downhill from there. I think I remember when I watched her show, if I'm not mistaken, It's been a long time. But I felt like at the very beginning of the Libyan war, she was kind of against it. Like, kind of, not fully against it. But she was kind of like opposing a no-fly zone or something, and then she got the memo. I remember that because she thought, coming out of the Bush years, that Democrats and liberals are against wars, and then they gave her the memo. No, we support this war. Pretty sad, you know. And the funny thing is, I actually know people who used to work with her. I know a few people. I'm not going to mention any names, but I know some individuals who actually worked with her at one point, and I'm not going to say anything further than that. But let me just say it hasn't helped my opinion of her at all. Hasn't increased my opinion of her, what I've heard from these people who worked with her. That's all I'll say about that. Don't want to get in too much trouble here, but not a big fan of Rachel Maddow. Not a big fan. Folks, what are we going to do? We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. And people want me to go on shows, make it happen. Tweet at them, tweet storm them. That's how I've been on shows. It's because of you all that I debated Destiny. It's because of you all that other people have had me on. If you want me on that show, you make it happen. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And on that note, folks, I'm out.